Okay, welcome everyone. We are here today to talk about developing and implementing effective sensory diets for children and teens. And I'm Gwen Wild. Before we really get going, I just need to state our financial disclosures out loud. I am the owner of Sensational Brain, which is the website that and the company that is sponsoring this course. And I do proceed from all sales, including BrainWorks related products. And all of you are getting a free, either a membership for completion of this course. If you don't already have one, if you already have a BrainWorks online membership, then you are getting a free single family or single classroom physical kit that we will ship to you. So for those of you who are watching the view on demand version of this course, please follow the instructions in the access email you received for how to either get your free kit or your free membership. For those of you here live, I will be showing you how to get the membership today. And if you already have a membership, then I'll give you instructions for how to request your kit. Okay? I have no other relevant financial or non-financial relationships to discuss relevant to the content we're talking about today. Okay. I am Gwen Wild. I'm an occupational therapist, and I live in the Kalamazoo, Michigan area, and we've lived here about 10 years. Prior to moving here, most of my time was spent in school-based OT. That's the majority of my background. I've done a few other things too, residential educational school with a private clinic. I've done a little bit of work in clinics here and there, but most of my years have been school-based therapy, which I love because I feel like it's so relevant to the lives of children, and it's a way to really meet their needs as they exist in the moment. So I've loved that. Upon moving here, I was kind of ready to take the next step in my career, and I started speaking mostly for Summit Professional Education at that time, and now I mostly do this. I manage my company. I do webinars, and I still do a lot of live seminars too. I still travel a fair amount, which I also enjoy. And then I do work PRN in a local clinic, and I do some consultation for a couple different schools close to me to keep my hand in therapy and my brain in the game. But this is the majority of what I do. So most of you are probably already familiar with my website, sensationalbrain.com. And if you haven't already done so, it's a great idea to join our email list, because that's the best way to find out about upcoming courses, new research, DIY ideas, things like that, sales. That's always good too. So a little hover box pops up when you visit our website periodically, and you can join our email list that way. My email address is gwen@sensationalbrain.com. And I am happy to answer emails. I do answer all emails I receive, but I do get quite a few of those emails. People just wanting a second opinion, or wanting to know my feelings on something. So I'm welcome to give you my opinions and input, as long as you know that's all they are. But I do get quite a few of those emails. So it's best to give me like 2 or 3 weeks to respond, rather than emailing me the day before an IEP meeting, because I may not be able to reply in time. We are on social media. I'm most active on Facebook at this time. So if you're into social media, that's a great place to follow us. We are also getting on Instagram and Pinterest. Just haven't done much with it yet, but hopefully soon. A little bit about my family. We have 3 daughters who are now 19, 17, and 15. So there is rarely a dull moment in our household. The oldest one is actually in college in Georgia. And the middle one will be going off to college in the fall. So heading toward empty nest, but right now I'm loving where we're at. It's a fun time of life. Okay, here is what we're going to be doing today. We're going to go over sensory diet theory. And I know a lot of you OTs may feel like you have all of the theory on sensory processing that you need, but we're just going to make sure that we're all using the same language and terminology and starting off at a level playing field, so we have something to move forward with. And then we will get into talking about assessment options, no matter what your discipline. We will talk about how do we teach self-modulation, because really our end goal is for the kids to have an internal understanding of their sensory needs and to know how to go about meeting those needs independently, rather than the sensory program needing to be owned and driven by the teachers and the parents and the therapists in that child's life. The ability to self-modulate will vary greatly depending on a child's age and cognitive level, but that's still our end goal, to get them to the highest level of self-modulation that we can. So we'll talk about some options for helping kids learn that. And then we will look at activities for modulation, mostly by looking at BrainWorks, your online membership, because that makes it easy to find activities broken down by type, like calming, alerting, or just right. And we'll look at some examples and talk about how we make that determination of which activities have which effect on the nervous system. We are then going to move into thinking about how do we put it all together. Once we determine a child's sensory needs, how do we develop a customized plan to meet his or her sensory needs? And then through case studies, we're going to look at what sensory diets look like in the home and what sensory diets look like at school. Okay, so let's get started. A sensory diet. This is a term that was originally coined by Patricia Wilbarger, who is an occupational therapist and developmental psychologist, and she started writing and researching and training in the 80s and has been joined by her daughter Julia, and they continue to do training worldwide. The sensory diet is defined as the optimum sensory motor input a person needs to feel alert, exert effortless control, and perform at peak. I like to define a sensory diet as nothing more than the strategic use of sensory activities. And this is something that most of us just do instinctively without even giving any thought to it. Like many of you probably have a cup of coffee in front of you right now, just like I do. I have to drink mine before it gets cold. Others of you may have a cold can of Mountain Dew. Some of you, when you get a little bit, I hate to say bored because I hope you're not bored, but as it gets more difficult to sit still throughout the day, you might find yourself twirling your hair, or tapping your foot, or some people, when I do live presentations, will get up and stand in the back of the room or pace. And these are sensory strategies you're using to help yourself focus and attend and prioritize which forms of sensory input are most important to you at the moment. So for most of us, this happens instinctively. Where problems come in is when people are not aware of their unmet sensory needs, or even if they're aware, they have no idea what to do to feel better, or to help themselves focus, or to get to that just right level of arousal. And that's when it becomes a disorder. We can have pretty extensive sensory needs. I myself do. I can tell you stories upon stories about my childhood, back before anybody knew what that was. I remember making my mom cry multiple times in third grade. I'm not sure why third grade. I think it has less to do with my age and more to do with that was when Bobby socks came in to style. And so with Bobby socks, you would fold them over and fold them over again. And they were kind of loose at the top. And I hated the way they felt. And they were never exactly the same height on my ankles. And I knew it was irrational, but it literally made me somewhat nauseous inside. And I would have these huge fits. And I'm a people pleaser. I was an easy kid to raise from a behavioral standpoint, but I just couldn't stand it. And I remember making my mom cry. And I think she was just at her wit's end, like, why is this child having a fit about socks? So it was weird, Now, at the time, possibly I did have a disorder. I knew what was wrong. I didn't know what to do about it. My mom had no clue what to do about it. But now, I can still see I have sensory issues. I get overstimulated fairly easily, but I recognize it, and I know what to do about it, and I have strategies I can use to help myself. So it's not a disorder. It only becomes a disorder when the people can't figure out how to regulate their needs independently. And those are the kids who really need our intervention the most. Okay, today we are primarily focusing on sensory modulation disorder because that's the form of sensory processing disorder that we are impacting through the use of a sensory diet. Now, most of you OTs will know that sensory processing disorder is an umbrella diagnosis, and it's right now a therapeutic diagnosis only, meaning it's not recognized by the medical community at large in that they don't have a code for it. So a lot of medical professionals, including doctors, do recognize that it exists, but they just don't have a code to give to it. So primarily this is a therapeutic diagnosis, typically made by an OT sometimes a PT or a speech therapist as well. But so sensory processing disorders are umbrella diagnosis. And then there are three subtypes of sensory modulation disorder. One subtype is a motor-based sensory processing disorder. And this is what we usually refer to as dyspraxia. So it's kids whose muscles and joints are the way they should be, but for whatever reason, they cannot coordinate themselves and motor plan in a way that allows them to be coordinated and interact with their environment in a successful way from a motor standpoint. So that's one form of sensory processing disorder. Another form is called sensory discrimination disorder, and this could apply to any of our sensory systems. But an easy example is to think about the tactile sensory system. And tactile discrimination allows me to put my hand, I can even reach into my desk drawer right now and feel around and come up with a Sharpie rather than a pen or even a regular marker, because I can tell by the way it feels, and that's my tactile discrimination at work. So if I have tactile discrimination disorder, I'm unable to tell the difference between similarities and different similar forms of input, etc. So that's the second form of sensory processing disorder. And then the third form of sensory processing disorder or type is sensory modulation disorder. This is what we're really going to be focusing on today. And sensory modulation has a lot of big terms and fancy definitions attached to it that you may remember back from your graduate school days. But the bottom line is that modulation is what allows us to focus on what is most important. If you are here today as a well-modulated person, hopefully you're able to focus on the sound of my voice and your computer screen, because that's what you've set aside today to do. And that's what's most relevant in your life at the moment. Hopefully you're able to put everything else kind of on the back burner of your brain, like whether you're a little thirsty or hungry, a little hot or cold, the feel of your clothing on your skin, the feel of your body weight on your chair. Hopefully you're able to put most of that on the back burner and focus most of your attention on what's most relevant at the moment. And if you're doing so, then you are modulating well right now, and that's a good thing. Now, another good clue for being well modulated is that your emotions and behaviors reflect appropriate responses to the situation rather than to the environment. That's kind of a big sentence to think through, but you know, as therapists, often when parents start bringing their kids to us, they're not exactly sure what's going on, but they'll say something like this: I can't quite put my finger on it, but he's just not like the other boys and girls. For example, last week, we had a birthday party for him, and he had a meltdown in the corner for the entire party. And that's perplexing to parents. They don't get it. You know, why would your child have a meltdown at his own birthday party? Because theoretically, situationally, everything's going his way, right? Presents are being given to him. He's the center of attention. Mom's made his favorite kind of birthday cake. There might be a bounce house in the backyard. So from a situational perspective, everything's going his way. So why is he having a meltdown? It's probably in reaction to the environment, which in this case is probably sending him into sensory overload, right? So that's a good place to start. You know, we always have to ask ourselves the question, how do we know if it's a sensory issue or a behavioral issue? It's good to start here. And more often than not, if they're reacting to something situational, it's more likely to be a behavioral response that you're witnessing. If they're responding to something environmental, it's more likely to be a sensory-based response that you're witnessing. I just have an example from my own life, again, since I have sensory issues. I despise grocery shopping. And bless my husband's heart, this is usually something that he does on the weekends. But if he doesn't, for some reason, you know, he's out of town, whatever, and I go to the grocery store, we have literally across the street from each other, Meijer. I don't think those are in the South, but those of you who are Northern might know Meijer. It's kind of similar to Super Target. So you can get all of your groceries and household needs at Meijer. This Meijer is in a newer building, and they've made good use of natural lighting, and I like the way the aisles are laid out. So I'm okay there. You know, if I spend an hour and a half at Meijer and I leave, I feel like a person who hates grocery shopping, but it's over with for the week, and I'm basically okay. But literally across the street from Meijer is a Walmart, and it's the kind of Walmart where you can get all of your groceries and household needs also. And if I spend the same hour and a half at that Walmart, um, and I leave, I am all kinds of grumpy inside. It just disturbs me. This is an older building, lots of fluorescent lighting that reflects on this linoleum floor. They've stacked the aisles to go almost all the way up to the ceiling, so you feel like you're walking through tunnels. It's just very distressing to me. So if you think about it in terms of the sentence, situationally, either way, it's the same. Either way, if I go to Meijer or Walmart, I've spent the same time shopping. The only difference is the environment. And so that tells me there's something in the environment at Walmart that's sending me through the roof. And whenever I present to a live audience, I always see several people nodding along. So I think somebody could make some money consulting with Walmart regarding their sensory environment. So this is kind of where we start. That's a nutshell. If you're interested in the sensory versus behavior debate, I'm starting a second 6-hour course next Friday, and that one's going to be a little bit different. It's going to be 2 hours per Friday for 3 consecutive Fridays. That's also going to be available on demand from our website. And so that one, we really dive in depth with the whole sensory and behavior viewpoint, where we're looking at things very holistically. But in a nutshell, this is where you start. Is it situational or is it environmental? And sometimes it'll be a little bit of both, and that's when we really need to look at it from all angles. Okay, now when we talk about sensory modulation disorder, we primarily recognize 3 subtypes. And I view this as a continuum, but it's not a straight line continuum. So let's start by looking at the left side. Everybody on this side of the continuum are over-responders. These people are having an over-responsive reaction to incoming sensory information. There's a book written for adults with sensory processing disorder. It's a good book. It's called Too Loud, Too Bright, Too Fast, Too Tight. I just love the title because it so accurately describes how these people feel the majority of the time. Everything's too much for them. They're frazzled and overwhelmed. They're having an out of proportion response to incoming sensory information. Whoops, earring just flew off. So that's over responsiveness. Now, at the other end of the continuum, we see a little fork in the road. Now, everybody at this end of the continuum are under responders. These people are having an under responsive reaction to incoming sensory information. But we actually see 2 different types of under responders. At the bottom of the fork in the road, we have what we're calling our passive under responders. These people are having an under-responsive reaction to incoming sensory information. What that actually means is that they need more sensory input than the rest of us do, either more in duration or more in intensity, but they need more in order to reach that same threshold that causes neurological changes in the brain. But these people either don't know they need more, or they know it and they perceive it as being too much effort. So for whatever reason, they just give up on getting the more, which is what they actually need, and instead they become passive, sedentary, lethargic, couch potato, TV junkie kinds of people. Now, these kids usually aren't a behavioral problem in the classroom, but they can be hard to educate because they're just not tuning in very well. They're the kids who are just kind of daydreamy, kind of lost in space. They just kind of, everything about them just sort of seems slow. They're slow to process, slow to move, slow to respond, slow to act. And they're often, usually these are the people who we'd call laid back. And when we say somebody is laid back, we do usually mean that as a compliment because we like laid back people. They're easy to get along with, they're happy-go-lucky, they're low drama. But so although all of these things have their pluses and minuses, it's a good thing, but it can become problematic because if you're too laid back in life, you tend to lack that oomph that motivates you. And that's what these kids tend to be lacking. They're the ones who are just constantly saying, come on, shake a leg, get a move on. Those kinds of kids. Get with it, focus, that kind of thing you find yourself saying. Those are the passive under responders. Okay? Now, at the top of the fork in the road, we see a different kind of kid. We call these sensory seekers or sensory cravers. Right now, really, the term of the day is sensory craver. So I'm going to try to use that. Sensory seeking, that's an interchangeable word, but sensory craving is kind of the term of the moment. And so these kids also are having an under-responsive reaction to incoming sensory information. But it seems like they get it. They know they need more, and they go into action to get the more. And so they start running and jumping and spinning and crashing and driving their teachers crazy in an attempt to reach that high threshold. Sometimes they get there. They may come back from PE and the teacher thinks, wow, she looks really good right now. Or they come back from recess and the teacher's just learned, I have about 15 minutes where she actually listens to me after recess. And what that tells us is that they are reaching that threshold where neurological changes happen. And we'll talk about what those are in a little bit. That then buys them a window of opportunity where they function their finest. But sometimes, because of the confines of the school or the home environment, or the rules that are in place for the purpose of safety, they're just never able to reach that high threshold. And so those are the kids who literally never stop moving. It's a drive. Just like it's hard for me to concentrate if I'm hungry, it's hard for these kids to do anything else until that drive is satisfied. So these kids, it's an adaptive response in that it shows us they know what they need. They may be using maladaptive strategies to try to meet that need, things that we cannot allow for various reasons, but it shows us that they do get it at some level. Now, I will just say that we kind of have a couple different camps of sensory gurus in our world, and therefore there are a couple different major ways of looking at sensory modulation differences. I feel like for the most part we're all saying the same thing. We're just using different language and different descriptors to get there. But I just say that because if you were to go to a conference by a different presenter, they may lay this out a little bit differently. You may hear different terminology used, but this continuum works for my brain. It works from a treatment standpoint, the theory that we're going to put forth today. So I hope it's helpful to you too in understanding these differences. Now, we do see a lot of overlap with people with the diagnoses listed at the top. Most people with learning disorders, ADD or ADHD, anything on the autism spectrum, genetic disorders like Fragile X and Down syndrome, and developmental delays in general. Most kids with one of these diagnoses will also have some degree of sensory modulation disorder going on as well. And then we, at least within the profession of OT, believe this can also be a standalone diagnosis where I don't have to have any other labels, but I could still have sensory modulation disorder that's impacting my daily life. Okay? The bottom line for all three is that the brain is having difficulty determining what is most important. This is the response threshold curve, and I just have found it really helpful to be able to visualize this, and I hope it's helpful for you to know what we're talking about when we say somebody has a high threshold for sensory input or a low threshold for sensory input. And what happens at the threshold is that we get a release of our beneficial neurochemicals, primarily serotonin and dopamine. There are some others involved as well, but those are two of the neurochemicals that play the biggest impact on sensory modulation. And they're two of the neurochemicals that we can most easily change through the use of sensory strategies. So those are two biggies, serotonin and dopamine. And when I reach my sensory threshold, meaning I get the right amount for me, then I get a release of these helpful neurochemicals, and that neurochemical change remains present for some period of time in my brain. The amount of time that neurochemical change stays in place depends on a lot of factors. My age, my developmental level, my own neurological makeup, lots of factors contribute. But we have some generalities, and these numbers primarily come to us from the world of exercise physiology and the research that they've done looking at neurochemical changes in response to movement. And so for most adults, and we feel like this kicks in somewhere around age 10. So for 10 and beyond, The number for most of us is 10 minutes every 2 hours. So about every 2 hours, I need to engage in moderate to higher intensity sensory input. And that gets me to this threshold where I get a release of my beneficial neurochemicals. And that allows me then another 2 hour window of opportunity where I function my finest. I'm the most emotionally even keeled. I'm the most mentally on track. I'm most in control of my body. My physical needs have been met, etc. So as therapists for a long time, we've suggested sensory breaks for about 10 minutes every 2 hours. And that's where that number and knowledge comes from, is that kind of research from the exercise physiology world. Because for the most part, most of our sensory strategies that we use during sensory breaks, they're forms of exercise or movement made playful and fun for children. So I felt very comfortable borrowing from that body of research and applying it to what we're talking about here. Okay? Now, most of us get there without even thinking about it. We do the 10 minutes every 2 hour thing without really thinking about it. Now, most of you, as teachers and therapists, have jobs that aren't going to allow you to ever sit still for more than 2 hours anyway. So you're kind of getting a steady influx of sensory input. So you may not need to be as aware of that. And on days when I work in a clinic or a school, absolutely, I don't even have to think twice about it because my movement needs are met. But on days that I work from my home office, which I'm in today, I need to be more aware of this. And it just usually happens spontaneously. Like I'll be sitting and working and I'm good. And then all of a sudden I'm like, man, I got to move. And I'll get up and take my dog outside, or I'll go make another pot of coffee or make a phone call and walk around while I'm on the phone. So I just naturally do that. And most of you would too, and today you might find yourself challenged because you're in a profession where you normally don't sit still. And today you're being asked to sit still for 6 solid hours. So you'll find yourself, thinking, man, I need to move. And we're going to try to incorporate some movement opportunities into this course today too. So let's just go back to the days that I work at home alone. I might take a 10-minute break to go take the dogs out and stuff. And then a couple hours later, it's lunchtime, and that's a moderately intense sensory experience. So I get up, make my lunch, sit down, eat. That counts. Mid-afternoon, I'm going to do something again. I usually go pick up my daughter then anyway. So I'm getting outside, I'm in the car, I'm driving, come back in, talk to her for a little bit, have a snack. I'm getting that 10 minutes every 2 hours again. After work, I often go for a jog or take the dogs on a walk. So I'm every 2 hours, I'm kind of getting that sensory break without putting a lot of thought into it. But for our kids who don't know what they need, or they don't know how to meet those needs successfulully, those are the kids who we're going to have to be more intentional with, to build this into their schedule, to make it a part of who they are. And I really feel like as therapists, we need to be preaching and teaching that all classrooms need to make sensory breaks a part of their daily schedules. And I love it when teachers attend this course. I know we have at least one here today because this is something that helps all kids. Our educational demands have just increased to the point where we are asking young brains to sit still, often for age inappropriate amounts of time, so that we have time to get all the curriculum into them that we need. But what we're now knowing and seeing in research is that we can do more education in less time if we're using movement breaks, because the brains become more effective in response to the movement. Okay, so there's a couple different kinds of breaks. I usually call them brain breaks and sensory breaks, but we'll talk more about those later and how to implement those. But for now, I just want to go over this threshold a little bit. So I reach this threshold multiple times throughout my day without really thinking about it. And it's fairly easy for me to get there because I have a fairly typical response to movement, okay? Now, over responders, and we're just talking about movement right now, which for you therapists in the crowd, we often refer to as vestibular input, right? Our vestibular sensory system is one of our 8 sensory systems that we typically know the least about before we become therapists. And our vestibular system starts in the semicircular canals of our inner ears, and there are little crystals called otoliths that are floating around in there, and they move as I move. And as they move, they press against cilia, which are little hair-like filaments, and those transmit a signal to my brain that basically tells me where I am in relationship to gravity. Am I tilted or upright? Am I moving fast or slow? Am I about to fall upside down on my head? That's what my vestibular system is telling me. So if I am over-responsive to vestibular input, that's represented by this red line, this low line at the bottom here. That means it takes hardly any vestibular input before my brain says, whoa, put on the brakes. This is too much for me. Okay? Now, we know that at some point they reach that healthy threshold where they get the release of serotonin and dopamine. But unfortunately, they don't get to benefit from that healthy release very long at all before they're catapulted into the stress cycle instead. So maybe, I'm in the morning, I'm getting ready for school. I bend over to put on my shoes and I stand back up. And I have a couple seconds of disequilibrium. And then I have a 45-minute bus ride to get to school, and I have all that motion sickness. So there had to be a point where I hit that healthy threshold, but then the bus ride lasted 10 minutes longer, or my head tilted a little bit too far to the side when I was getting dressed, something like that. And I don't get to benefit from the healthy release of serotonin and dopamine because instead I go into fight or flight. Cortisol is released, which is a stress hormone that causes its own negative chain reaction of events. So I don't get to benefit from that beneficial release of neurochemicals very long at all before I'm displaying this overreactive response. Okay, so over-responders have a low threshold, meaning it takes hardly any input at all before they're overwhelmed. Under-responders have a high threshold, and this applies to both our passive under-responders as well as our sensory cravers. So that means they need more input to get that same release of serotonin and dopamine that most of us get in response to a lot less input or less intensity. It could be intensity or it could be duration. Either one. They need more. So let's talk about our passive kids first. Probably somewhere in the preschool years when they become socially aware, they start looking around and figuring out, that typical play that all the other kids think is fun, like swings and slides and playing chase on the playground, it just doesn't do anything for me. They don't perceive it as fun because it's not at a high enough level or high intensity enough level to cause a release of dopamine in their brain. Dopamine is our pleasure and reward feedback neurochemical. If we do not get a release of dopamine in response to sensory input, we will not experience it as pleasurable. We will not perceive it to be pleasurable. So they try out the swings, they try out the slides. It's not enough to reach that threshold for them, so they do not get a release of dopamine, so they do not think it's fun. And they just kind of give up on that typical play, that those forms of movement that generate that pleasure response for most kids. They give up on it. They'd rather just kind of sit on the curb and chat with their teachers or find a group of kids to mingle with at a social level or at a sedentary level because they just don't perceive that movement to be fun or exciting. So they give up, okay? These kids, the passive kids, they often become video game guru, TV junkie kinds of kids. And that's because visual input is momentarily satisfying. In the moment, it does give you a rush, but it doesn't have any sustaining quality. Movement causes a release of neurochemicals that's sustained over time because of the mix of neurochemicals there. Some of them have a longer acting response than others. Visual input gives you this short burst, but as soon as I take away the screen or the iPad, then I don't have anything that sustains that neurochemical change over time. It's very similar. Let's just keep, we're calling this a sensory diet that we're going to talk about today. So let's just use a food analogy again. Visual input, like TV screens and video games and iPads, that's sugar for the brain. It's momentarily satisfying, but it doesn't cause neurochemical change that's sustained over time. Movement, however, is the protein for the brain. Movement allows us to have a response that's sustained even after I stop moving for up to 2 hours, possibly, depending on my age. So just like if I, at lunch, ate a bag of Skittles, I would temporarily be satisfied, but 30 minutes later, I'm going to be hungry again, right? The same thing happens here. Kids love their iPads and their video games, and they seem really engrossed in it at the moment. But once that screen goes off, they got nothing, where if we get them moving, then they have something to sustain them. So our passive kids often become video game, TV junkie kids because of that quest to get that dopamine release, but it's just not all that helpful, really. Now, our sensory cravers also have the same high threshold. They also need more. But what seems to happen with these kids probably starts in the preschool years again. They're looking around and thinking, that typical play that the other kids think is fun, it's just not enough for me. But I know what I need. I need more. Maybe if I go down the slide head first, I'll reach that threshold. Maybe if I climb over the 6-foot playground fence and jump down, I'll reach that threshold. Maybe if I tackle my peers, I'll reach that threshold, right? So they're on this quest to reach that threshold. Sometimes they get there, sometimes they don't. And whether they do or they don't could depend on exactly how high their threshold is. It could depend on how successful they are in knowing the kinds of activities that will allow them to get there in the least amount of time. Could depend on their age and their cognitive level. There's a lot of different factors that contribute, but some kids get there even if they have a high threshold. And then other times some kids don't, or some kids just cannot do that safely within the guidelines that are in place. So hopefully that helps it make sense to you. Under responders have a high threshold, meaning they need lots. Over responders have a low threshold, meaning it doesn't take much and you can quickly send them into the stress cycle instead. Those of you who are attending live today, feel free to use the chat box to ask me questions at any time if you need another explanation of anything. Okay, we're just going to go over each of these terms a little more in depth to make sure that we're all using the same language. In the past, our over-responders have often been called sensory defensive or hypersensitive. These are all interchangeable terms, but over-responsiveness is the term of the day, and I feel like it's a little bit more comprehensive and descriptive as well. This refers to an over-responsiveness, in particular, of the protective part of the nervous system, or the fight or flight branch of the nervous system. It may be generalized, meaning I have an over-responsive reaction to multiple forms of sensory input, or it may be specific to 2 or 3 forms of input. Most of these kids who are over-responders are seen as avoiders. Their behaviors are either attempts to avoid the obnoxious stimuli in the first place, or to try to recover from the inevitable that's bound to occur. These kids primarily need calming activities, so we're going to use calming strategies to meet their sensory needs. Kathleen just asked a good question. She said, your description of theory is most in line with Lucy Jane Miller's work. Correct. It is, yes. And we're using terminology from Lucy Jane Miller. For those of you who don't know, Lucy Jane Miller is she is the head of the STAR Foundation. I believe that's its name right now. It used to be the STAR Center and the SPD Foundation, and they've merged. And I think now it's called the STAR Foundation in Denver. And she is definitely one of the leaders in the field of sensory processing. And then I would say another major leader, and some are in line with Lucy Miller, some of our big leaders also, like Diana Henry, very much in line with Lucy Jane Miller as well. And then kind of our other camp of gurus, I feel like, is probably Winnie Dunn. She is the author of the Sensory Profile. I'm a big Winnie Dunn fan as well. So, I really see the truths in kind of the way that they're both preaching and teaching. And I kind of find myself somewhere in the middle, but the terminology we're using today definitely is more in line with Lucy Jane Miller's. Okay, so our over-responders need calming strategies. Our passive under-responders, these are the kids I often refer to as the bump on the log kids. They're the ones who are there, they're physically present, but they just aren't tuning in very well. They're the kids who are just constantly saying, come on, stick with me, listen, those kinds of kids. They're usually slumping, slouching, leaning on something, those kinds of kids. These kids even have a tendency to be overweight. Not always, but you'll find once you start looking that more often than not, the pudgy kids in your classroom or on your caseload tend to be passive under-responders. And that's for a couple of different reasons. First of all, they're not the movers and the shakers in our world, which is already going to predispose them to struggling with their weight because they don't perceive movement as fun. And then also, if we are not getting that release of serotonin and dopamine and some of the other neurochemicals in response to movement, do you know another way that we can get that release? Food, primarily carbohydrates. So these kids are movement avoiders, carbohydrate cravers, which just predisposes them to having issues with their weight. I really even feel that a lot of our adults in our society who struggle with obesity, the underlying issue is passive underresponsiveness. Truly, start thinking about either yourself or your family members or your friends who struggle with their weight. And most often, they are people who don't really enjoy physical activity or exercise. And if we are not getting that neurochemical release in response to exercise, we will not perceive it as fun. Let me just go back to that slide a minute, though. That shows the thresholds. What happens for most of us who are processing at a typical level, I can engage in a lot of different forms of exercise that easily get me to this threshold. Running, weightlifting, things like that. I'm a runner, and so I can easily get to this threshold. Now, my mom hates exercise, but she hasn't tried much, like walking. She's tried walking. Because she's a passive underresponder, walking, which is more at this typical level, it's not enough. It doesn't cause that release of dopamine for her. So no wonder she hates it. And if you are not getting that dopamine release in response to the movement, it takes more self-discipline than humans have to make yourself get out the door and do it again. Now, my mom could get to her high threshold through other forms of exercise. She would be better off like in a group exercise environment, because the socialization, the music, the sounds, the visual stimulation, the rapid change in activities, that's going to help her get to this threshold much quicker than simple walking in a quiet neighborhood would, right? So when you're thinking about how to meet your sensory needs, think about if it's a high threshold person, we need to be intense and multi-sensory stimulation. For those of us who are more typical, jogging is probably enough. For over-responders, these people typically, I'm an over-responder. I don't like gyms. I don't like group workout sessions. It's too much for me. I strongly prefer jogging in my neighborhood or on a country road, because that's much more in line with my sensory needs. So when we're talking about teens and on through adulthood, I do look at exercise as the primary ingredient of their sensory diet, but the types of exercise I steer them toward will depend on their threshold, whether they need intense multi-stimulating input that they'd probably receive most in a group gym environment, or whether they need something that's more one-on-one or independent, and more of a repetitive type of input like walking or jogging or biking could be. Okay? All right, let me go back here a minute. So these underresponders, our passive underresponders, are needers. They need more input than what they're getting, but they seem helpless to do anything that allows them to meet those needs independently. From a treatment standpoint, these kids need alerting and stimulating activities. And that's pretty intuitive, because if you have your little bump on the log, you're constantly saying, come on, shake a leg, get a move on. And you're trying to stimulate them with your words and your tone of voice and maybe even the way that you touch them. Okay, our sensory cravers. These kids are the least intuitive for us. It's hardest for us to meet these kids' needs. It's very difficult for us to meet their needs. These are the ones who keep us up at night. These are the kids who drive their teachers crazy. These kids are the ones we struggle with the most. But it's helpful to remember that they have the same underlying issue as their passive peers. They also are under-responders. They also have a high threshold. But at some level, they get it. They know what they need. They go into motion to meet that need. So these are the kids who never stop moving. They tend to be thrill seekers. They tend to love a good challenge. Now, many of you who are here watching this recording or participating live, a lot of you are under responders, either passive or sensory cravers. And that's because our sensory needs largely drive our career choice. So the majority of you are under responsive because you've chosen careers that put you out there. You're moving, you're interactive, you're social. You're not locked away in a quiet cubicle. So lots of you will have traits of these kids. You might love scary movies or love roller coasters or some of the like bungee jumping, things like that. And these kids love those kinds of things as well. Now, we know that these people have a lot of long-term potential, just like all of you, because these people tend to be the movers and the shakers in the world. It's just helping them survive school that's the challenge. As long as there are no other complicating diagnoses. Now, sometimes there are some other complicating factors, but in otherwise typically developing kids, we just have to help them survive school, and then they're going to be people who make things happen in life. Now, these kids are seen as needers. They're needing more input than what they're getting, either longer duration or more intensity to reach that high threshold. So their behaviors are attempts to reach that high threshold where registration occurs and they get that neurochemical release. So we see them mainly as needers. Now, here's where we tend to go wrong. If we see a kid in your class who's running and jumping and spinning and crashing, what do we think we want to do? Our first response is we want to calm them down, right? So we try peaceful music, dimming the lights, maybe some of our compression garments or weighted equipment. And how does that work for you? Typically not well. Sometimes it helps a little, but not very well. And the reason why our calming strategies don't help is because that's not really what they need. What they really need is help reaching that threshold. And how do we reach that threshold? Through the most intense, stimulating forms of input we have access to. Let's go back to look at this threshold for a minute. Okay, so let's say that a kid in your classroom is running and jumping and spinning and crashing. So they're way up here on the threshold curve. Now, we could try our traditional calming strategies like peaceful music and deep pressure input, and it probably does help a little bit. It's better than doing nothing at all. So they were here, now they're here, okay? Our calming strategies are a Band-Aid. It's better than doing nothing at all, but it's not a fix. What's the fix? The fix is helping them reach this threshold. So really what we want to give them is access to the most alerting, stimulating forms of input we can give them. So we're going to stimulate to the threshold. Once they get there, the neurochemical change takes place. Thank you. My needs have been met. It actually looks like we've calmed them down, but we just don't get there through traditional calming strategies for these kids. Most of you have seen this at play in typically developing children as well. Like those of you who are parents, think about things when your kids come home and they're bouncing off the walls. Maybe they've been to a birthday party or something. They're bouncing off the walls. They've had too much sugar. What do you say to them? You often will say something like, go outside and burn off that extra energy, right? Essentially what you're doing is allowing them to stimulate to the threshold where that neurochemical change takes place, and then they appear calmer, even though you haven't used calming strategies to get there, right? This is also very similar to what we do from a medication standpoint for kids with ADHD. Now, interestingly, symptoms of ADHD are so similar to symptoms of sensory craving that I think there are oftentimes misdiagnoses going on. Doctors may be seeing a child who is a sensory craver, and it's being labeled as ADHD because that's a medically based diagnosis that doctors have access to. So, there are a lot of thoughts on SPD versus ADHD, and Lucy Jane Miller's group has done a fair amount of research. So if you're interested in that, I would go to the Star Foundation website and just type into the search box ADHD versus SPD. There's some great articles on there that help you know the differences. But right now, I would just summarize by saying, if you are seeing a kid who has a label of ADHD, I don't think we're at a point in time where we can assume that that means that they don't actually have sensory modulation disorder, because I don't think doctors currently have access to diagnostic tools that allow them to differentiate ADHD versus SPD. So if I'm looking at a kid like that, the way that I go about it, and I see kids in the clinic where I work at very part-time here, is, a lot of parents bring their kids because they don't want them put on meds. And they'll say, can you help them from a sensory approach? And my general answer is, it depends on whether it's actually sensory processing disorder or if it's actually ADHD. we can find out through implementing a strong sensory approach and seeing how far it gets us. In some kids, it's enough, and we may be able to avoid medications. If that's the case, that's probably truly SPD, sensory craving variety. If I try a good sensory approach and the parents are following through with a sensory program at home, and after 1 to 2 months, we're not seeing significant change, that leads me to believe it's probably true ADHD, where they will probably benefit from medication and will be their needs will most effectively be met by going that route. Now, Lucy Jane Miller's research shows that about 40% of the time kids have both ADHD and SPD, that the overlap is that high. So sometimes you'll see a kid who has both, and they may need medication in addition to a sensory diet. So, if parents are reluctant to start meds, I would say let's try a good sensory approach first and see if it's enough. If it is truly a sensory processing issue, there will be a threshold. So often that's what I'm doing in either my direct treatment time or my one-on-one time in a clinic, is I'm trying to see, is there a threshold? If I can reach a threshold, I'm much more convinced that I can reach this from a sensory diet approach or a sensory integration theory approach. If I do not ever see that I'm reaching a threshold, then I'm pretty likely that after about a month, I'm going to say, I don't think this is the right path for your child. I have to be able to reach that threshold in order in a reasonable amount of time, in order for a sensory-based approach to be effective. Okay? Now, sometimes we inadvertently end up finding out that they have an incredibly high threshold, and we just have to ask ourselves if we can get there in a reasonable amount of time. Like one time I saw this kid in the clinic, and I had 60-minute treatment sessions, and usually in a clinic, I can reach even the highest threshold within that 60-minute treatment time, because in a clinic, I have suspended equipment and crash pads and the whole 9 yards. So I can usually reach that threshold. And I know that I'm reaching that threshold when I start seeing adaptive responses. That's what we're looking for. And these are just subtle changes in a child that tells you, she looks good right now, So you're looking for things like muscle tone, eye contact, voice quality. Functional communication is a big one. We're starting to get a lot of speech therapists taking this course because they're realizing, if I can get to that just right level of arousal, then my therapy sessions are so much more effective. And that's a very common adaptive response that I see, that when kids first come in, they're not able to answer questions coherently or engage in two-way conversation very effectively. And then once we start reaching that threshold, they just have a much a better functional communication style going on. Sometimes I'm looking at things like motor planning, that initially things that are very challenging for them, once we reach that threshold, they're able to complete those kinds of tasks because their different centers of the brain are communicating more effectively. So you're just looking for those subtle signs that make you think, she looks good right now. I can't quite put my finger on it, but she looks her best. And that's when you're reaching that threshold. For sometimes with sensory cravers, the best way I know I've got there is that I see satiation. That's a big, major adaptive response. So you see a kid who literally never stops moving, that's satiation. That tells me she's finally received enough input where she's gotten those neurochemical changes in her brain. So those are the kinds of things you're looking for that help you think, I'm reaching that threshold through these types of strategies. So, often that's what I'm doing in my session, is seeing, can I get there? If I can't get there in a reasonable amount of time, then this sensory-based approach is probably not going to be super effective for this particular child. Okay? Okay. So, I'm sorry. I wanted to finish that sentence. I kind of go in different tangents with medication. When we think about kids with ADHD, what kinds of meds are most often prescribed for them? Stimulants, right? And that's because research has shown that kids with ADHD need more stimulation in order to get that dopamine release in their brain, which then buys them a window of opportunity where they function their finest. So we are trying to do the same thing. We are trying to stimulate to the threshold, but we're using activities rather than meds. So we're going to stimulate to the threshold, we get the release of dopamine, buys them a window of opportunity where they're able to function their finest. Okay? Okay. Now, it is important to note that sometimes this seems to backfire on us. We allow a child to engage in a stimulating activity, but they end up looking worse rather than better. And you're thinking, where is that healthy threshold of which Gwen taught us about? Now, I see that too, and this used to really be a stumbling block for me. For example, mini trampolines. We consider these to be a stimulating form of input. And a lot of classrooms and school buildings have mini trampolines. So I used to think, okay, I'm going to put this sensory craver on a mini trampoline for 10 minutes during his sensory break, and that should allow him to reach his threshold. But what happens is they get on the mini trampoline and they are getting more revved up and more revved up and more revved up, and it just looks like they're flying off in the stratosphere. They are more disorganized than ever when the end of that 10 minutes, when the 10-minute ends. Now, I can't completely explain this, but here's what I think is going on. If I'm on a mini trampoline, I'm getting some proprioceptive input to my lower extremities, nothing to my upper body. Meanwhile, I'm getting a whole lot of really intense visual and vestibular input from that up and down motion. So I'm getting a lot of really stimulating input without any proprioceptive input to keep me grounded. So I am just getting more and more and more wound up, right? So when we think about intervening with sensory cravers, we have to be really intentional about what their sensory breaks look like in order for them to effectively reach that threshold without just losing it altogether. And I thought I have a slide later on where I'm going to show you the principles for that. I'm sorry. I'm a little discombobulated today, but we will return to that conversation, I promise. Okay, so just suffice to say that I know sometimes it seems like that doesn't work for these kids, and we will talk about both Plan A and what I call Plan B for our sensory cravers when it's really difficult to reach that healthy threshold without making them worse rather than better. So we will return to that conversation, I promise. Now, these are just two little guys. I was taking pictures a few years back of this classroom because this first grade teacher has done some amazing things in her classroom. She has a lot of options, seating options. There's a tent, there's a teepee. You can stand to work. So I was really taking pictures of the classroom to show the strategies available. But these two little guys popped up on my screen, and they were two that I worked with. And it just made me laugh out loud because these pictures make it so obvious that one is a passive under responder and one is an over responder. So you can just see it visually. The little guy on the left he's mildly involved, but he is a passive under responder. He's kind of a little bump in the log. He's always just kind of slouching. He's very laid back. He's not a behavior problem, but he was having a little bit of a hard time focusing and therefore learning because information just wasn't being processed quite like it should be. Now, this guy on the left was much more involved. He did have a meltdown before I left the room this day that the picture was taken. And you can kind of see it coming, you know? He's wound up tighter than a kite string. He's smiling, but he doesn't really look happy. Bless his little heart, he is trying to keep it together. But in reality, he's very overstimulated at that point in time. Okay. Now, so far, we've talked about it in very black and white terms, like you're either over-responsive or you're under-responsive. And we wish that were true because it would be so much simpler to design a sensory diet for someone who was all one or all the other. But in reality, very few of us are all one or all the other. I've only treated a handful of kids in my time that were over-responsive across the board or under-responsive across the board. And the reason for that is that we have 8 different sensory systems. So what we really want to be envisioning is 8 different continuum lines, one for each of the 8 sensory systems. And what most of us will end up finding out is that we are over-responsive to 2 or 3 forms of sensory input, but we tend to be under-responsive to 2 or 3 other forms of input. So that's very common, far more common than that. We do see a pretty consistent pattern for people on the autism spectrum. Most people on the spectrum are over-responsive to the FAR sensory systems. These are the sensory systems that tell us what's going on in the world around us. They're the 5 we learned about in elementary school. So sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. Most people on the spectrum tend to be over-responsive to those forms of input and under-responsive to the near sensory systems. These are the three sensory systems that tell us what's going on in our own bodies. And those three sensory systems are vestibular sensory system, which tells us where we are in relationship to gravity, our proprioceptive sensory system, which is our true sense of self and how I'm put together. This is the sensory system that allows me to touch my nose with my eyes closed because I know where my parts are without looking. This is our most primitive sensory system, meaning it's the first one to develop in utero. It's also the first sensory system to go with a lot of physical disorders like Parkinson's disease or when you've had too much to drink, which is why this is a test of sobriety. So, the reason why drunk driving is so dangerous is that because if I don't even know how my parts are put together, if I don't even have that true sense of self, then there is no way that I can interact with my environment safely, right? If I don't even know where I am, how am I going to make good decisions about how far my car is from the stop sign and so forth? So that's why it's so dangerous, is because proprioception goes when you've had too much to drink. It goes away and you don't even know where you are. So that's your true sense of self. It's vital. We begin almost every good sensory program with a healthy dose of proprioceptive input because we have to have that true sense of self first before we have any way in order to make sense of the world around us. And then our third near sense has just kind of recently been added as the eighth sensory system. Back when I was in school, we learned about 7, and now we're talking about 8. And the interoceptive sensory system is that 8th sensory system. And this is something I've been researching a lot lately. This is our sensory system that gives us information about what's happening internally. Are we hungry or thirsty? Are we in pain? Are we ill? Do we have to go to the bathroom? Am I hungry or thirsty? All of this is coming to me from my interoceptive sensory system. Interoception is also what allows us to identify our emotions, because we identify emotions based on that internal awareness. Like, I come to recognize that when my stomach feels kind of weird and flippy inside and my muscle tone's a little bit high and my heart's beating fast, I know I'm anxious, right? When I just feel really low and slow, I know I'm a little bit depressed. So we learn to identify our emotions based on physiological signs and symptoms that comes from interoceptive awareness. So anyway, it's just super interesting. The more I learn, the more I want to learn. It's kind of that missing link that helps make that connection between sensory input and emotional responses. Very fascinating. Okay, so when we say that people on the spectrum are over-responsive to input from the far and under-responsive to input on the near, this manifests behaviorally with things like over-responsiveness to visual input. They may cover their eyes or squint, or visual stim. I used to think that visual stim, like flicking something near their eyes, was a sign that they wanted more visual input, but I don't think that anymore. Now I really think that visual stim is a way to focus on something rhythmic and predictable that I can control, and it helps me disregard everything non-rhythmic and non-predictable that I have no control over in the world at large. So I really see it more now as a sign of visual over-responsiveness. Auditory over-responsiveness leads to ear covering or head hitting or out of proportion reactions to everyday sounds. Over-responsiveness to olfactory and gustatory contribute to picky eating. It's very hard to find a child with autism who's not a picky eater. Tactile over-responsiveness contributes to picky eating as well, along with strong preference for certain clothing or avoidance of light touch or unexpected touch. Meanwhile, we see under-responsiveness to the near sensory systems, which leads to behaviors like jumping, flapping, toe walking, twirling. Most of these behaviors are attempts to get more vestibular and proprioceptive input than what they would otherwise get. And under-responsiveness to interoceptive input leads to difficulty with toilet training, sometimes a lack of awareness of hunger or thirst, sometimes a lack of awareness of illness or pain. So those are common things we see in our kids on the spectrum. Okay, we're going to take a quick little brain break to meet our own needs for input. And when we talk about movement, we really see through research that we need two different types of movement opportunities each day. One is that we need short opportunities to stand up and get in touch with our body and sit back down. These are short, but they have to happen pretty frequently. I often call these brain breaks, and that's what we often, when we talk about brain breaks in schools, we're talking about just those short little bursts of input. And brain breaks can literally be like no more than 30 to 60 seconds. They could be longer, but to qualify as a brain break, 30 to 60 seconds is enough. And really just standing up and get in touch with your body is enough. So we're just going to do a quick little brain break now. And for those of you who are seated, I just want you to start out seated and just turn toward your right and grab onto the right corner of your chair and just stretch yourself all the way in that direction. Take a deep breath in this direction. Okay, now go to the other side. Grab the left corner of your chair, stretch all the way in that direction, and take a big, deep breath in that position. Okay, now go ahead and push your chair back and stand up and reach all the way up toward the ceiling. Come up on your tippy toes and reach, 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 reach. Now go all the way down and touch your toes. And come back up. Okay, have a seat. Take a deep belly breath. And you should be good to go again. So brain breaks, according to research, we know two things. As adults, it seems that, based on research, we need a short opportunity for movement like that at least every 50 minutes, 50 minutes to stay alert and ultimately on task. And again, we feel like those adult numbers kick in somewhere around age 10, okay? So 10 and up, about every 50 minutes, we need a short opportunity to get in touch with our body, okay? Now, we also see pretty good research, and I'm looking at numerous research studies. I can't point you toward one in particular, but at the kindergarten level, it looks like the majority of studies agree that about every 15 minutes, kindergartners need a brain break. So if we know that kindergartners need it every 15 minutes, and by about age 10 and above, we need it every 50 minutes, we can kind of surmise what the in-between ages need. And I've just come up with a loose formula that seems to work, and we used it in our latest research study. Start with every 15 minutes in kindergarten, and then add 5 minutes per grade. So every 20 minutes in first grade, every 25 minutes in second grade, every 30 minutes in third grade, and so forth. The good thing is, by the time you get to middle school, you'll be at about every 50 minutes, which is the adult pattern, and most middle schoolers change classes every 50 minutes, and that can count as their brain break, okay? So another point about the frequency of breaks, it really has more to do with your cognitive developmental level than it does with your chronological age. So if you are teaching teenagers who are functioning more like 5-year-olds from a cognitive developmental standpoint, then I would give them brain breaks every 15 minutes because it's more associated with their developmental level than with their chronological age. Okay, so that's one type. And then the second type are what I refer to as sensory breaks, just to distinguish the two. Brain breaks are short and frequent. Sensory breaks are less frequent, but longer duration and sometimes higher intensity. The goal of a sensory break is really to reach that healthy threshold. A brain break, you don't necessarily have to reach a threshold. You just have to get in touch with your body. Sensory break, the goal is really to reach that healthy threshold. Okay? So they're less frequent, but longer duration and higher intensity. That's a sensory break. Okay. Back to our slides. We see, well, since most of us are over-responsive to some forms of input and under-responsive to others, how do I know? Do I give them a calming activity? Do I give them an alerting strategy? How do I know? Typically, what we're going to do is think about their response to movement, because those big three, I call them the big three, and those are the near sensory systems. Most of our sensory activities are proprioceptive and vestibular in nature. We have a lot of tactile ones too, but movement is really what gives us that longest lasting impact on the neurochemicals. So if I see from their sensory assessment that they're over responsive to movement, typically I'm going to give them calming movement strategies. If I see that they're under responsive to movement, I'm typically going to give them movement activities to engage in during their sensory breaks. But another thing that I'm going to think about is, how does it relate to the target behavior? What factors are contributing to the behavior I'm hoping to change, and address those specifically. And we'll look at that more throughout the day for sure when we look at our forums and our case studies. And then here's another little generality for you. Adaptations and accommodations are most effective at addressing the needs of the far sensory systems, while movement is most effective at addressing the needs of the near sensory systems. So if I see from their sensory assessment, for example, that they're over responsive to visual input is one of the near sensory systems, one of the far sensory systems. So I'm going to think about, how can I adapt and accommodate? If they are over responsive to visual input, I may give them a baseball visor to limit their visual field, or I may allow them to work in a study carrel to help them disregard distracting input. Or I may dim the lights during a time when I really want to help them focus, or use natural lighting. So I can use accommodations and adaptations most effectively to meet the needs of the far sensory systems. When it comes then to the needs of the near sensory systems, I most often have to use movement opportunities. And so if they're under responsive, I'll use alerting. If they're over responsive, I'll use calming. So those are some generalities, but we're going to get a lot more comfortable with this as we go throughout the day. Another good clue, this one has been really helpful for me, is affect, right? Affect is emotional presentation. So if you see typically, okay, you know what? I just want to jump back to our continuum slide here for a minute. Okay. If you see negative affect, like a child who appears stressed or frustrated or angry, that's a pretty good sign that there's something driving them crazy. They're having an over-responsive reaction. Therefore, we're going to use calming strategies at that moment in time when we see negative affect. When we see some type of fairly positive affect, if they're sensory cravers, their affect is usually hyper, giddy, manic-y. If we see that, I'm going to give them alerting, because that tells me that they're needing more of something. Our passive under-responders usually have an affect that would be described as melancholy, sedentary, content, those kinds of things. Still, I'm going to choose alerting, because that tells me that I'm seeing and that they need more at that moment. So affect is your best friend. There are some behaviors that can be a combination of both. For example, a lot of headbangers, kids who engage in self-injurious behaviors like headbanging or wrist biting, those are confusing behaviors, and they can be driven by a lot of different things. But affect really helps me, because you may have two different headbangers in your classroom, and one headbanger is beating his head on a wall, but he's crying and he's moaning and he's groaning. He's visibly agitated. His affect tells me there's something that's driving him crazy. Yes, he may seek deep pressure input to his head, and that's why he's banging his head, but he's doing it to help himself tune out or override something that's driving him crazy. Therefore, if I can take away or minimize whatever's driving him crazy, he probably will stop banging his head, right? That's a common pattern. Many of us use a form of input we like to help us override or cope with something going on that we do not like. That's very common. So a lot of these kids, maybe it's auditory input that they're over responsive to. So the louder the classroom gets, the more they need to bang their head. They're using head banging to help them cope with or override the noise level in the classroom. The negative affect tells me he's doing it because something's driving him crazy. If I see that he's over responsive to auditory input, I can pretty safely assume it's the noise level at that moment. And so I may give him noise reduction headphones or allow him to do his work in the hall, something like that. But you may have another kid in that same classroom, and she's like giddy and laughing out loud while she's banging her head. that tells me she's doing it just because she likes it. She likes the feel of it. She likes the fact that headbanging results in a burst of serotonin, and it does because it's proprioceptive in nature. She's doing it just for the fun of it. So it's going to be harder for me to treat that, honestly, because I cannot safely match the intensity of that which she's giving herself. But I do know calming strategies aren't going to be helpful in that case. What I want to help her engage in are some of the most intense, stimulating, alerting strategies I can, and hope that it matches or comes close to matching the intensity of that which she's giving herself. So affect can be your best friend. In general, negative affect, we're going to use calming strategies. Positive affect, we're going to use alerting strategies to help them meet their needs. Okay? Excuse me. Okay, so I just want to give you a little bit of background into why we believe that that this is a research-based form of intervention. And as OTs, we've heard for a long time there's not enough evidence to support a sensory integration frame of reference. And I just have a couple of soapbox issues in response to that. First is that this approach really is still in its infancy. Early childhood at best, if we use that analogy. If you think about some other types of approaches, like a behavioral approach or a cognitive behavioral approach, these have been around for literally centuries. We see a behavioral approach back into the biblical days. So it's definitely had a lot more time, or a cognitive approach like we see when we go to counseling. We see research on that for at least the last 100 years. So these approaches have had a lot of time to get a lot of research under their belt. And we are still, from a sensory integration perspective, really just within the last 40 years, and the majority of us happened in the last 10 to 15 years, truthfully. So we're just starting to see enough of, pilot studies, base level studies to build on, to start getting momentum going. So that's my first thing I want to say is don't be discouraged by the lack of research, because we just have to get a foundation on which to build. And that's what we've been doing for the last couple of decades. Now, another thing that I will say is that there is an ever-growing body of evidence. The Star Foundation's website does a great job of cataloging all of the evidence in response to a true sensory integration frame of reference. That's usually like clinically based intervention, the one-on-one type of sensory integration therapy, which often isn't super applicable to what those of you who work in schools are able to do, or in home-based intervention. So, but it's there, and it's good to know that we're on the right path with the use of sensory-based intervention. And then I will also say we are getting more and more studies that show evidence that alternative seating makes differences in these areas, or the use of weighted garments helps with sleep, or whatever. We're starting to see growing body of knowledge there. And then if we're willing to look outside of our field into the fields of exercise physiology, physical education, kinesiology, we see even more evidence really looking at the neurochemical change in response to movement. And again, when we're talking about proprioceptive and vestibular input, all we're really talking about is movement or exercise, forms of exercise made playful and fun for children. So I think we can definitely feel comfortable borrowing from their body of evidence and showing that what we're doing impacts the brain. So I feel like we have a lot to go forth from. Now, I have personally been involved in 2 studies. I'm going to tell you about those in a minute. Now, one more thing that I want to say, our research link isn't active right now. We are getting a new website. I'm super excited. Kind of a fresh build that hopefully will be online April 19th, knock on wood. So for those of you who are watching the view on demand version of this course, after that, it's probably already up. But for those of you who are here live today, our research link isn't currently working because of this transition, but it will be soon. And that's where we're going to just list other studies that show the effect of movement, the effect of lighting changes, the effect of alternative seating. So all of that will be on our website very soon. If you're participating live today, may already be there if you're watching the video at some later point. And when you're looking at those kinds of studies, what we see is typically change in the 10 to 30% range. Like wearing a weighted vest may help a child focus 26% better. That's an actual statistic from one study. Things like that. So we often see change in the 10 to 30% range, and that's good to know. It's helpful, it's not a cure. Now, when we look at a sensory diet approach, I think our range that we see is more like 10 to 60% because the sensory diet is combining several strategies in a customized manner according to the needs of the child. So it makes sense that our statistic will be higher when we're using more than one strategy to impact a child's ability to focus or attend or communicate or whatever it might be that we're looking at. So really, I see our range as being 10 to 60%, but I just always say 10 to 40%. And I'll show you where that number came from, because I would rather always undersell rather than oversell. If I oversell the results of a sensory diet or the potential results, I lose people. I used to do this too often. I'm embarrassed to say. Like, I would go to a teacher and basically say, if you do everything on this very detailed sensory diet list according to the schedule that I've written out, then all your problems with this child will go away. That's how I made it seem. And first of all, they're kind of overwhelmed by this schedule I'm asking them to follow. And sometimes the kids need it, sometimes they don't. Sometimes it just doesn't fit with the agenda. So they quickly become discouraged, and I go back to follow up and I say, how's it going? And they say, he's still a difficult kid, so it's not helping. And they're right. These kids are difficult kids, and the reality is they're going to continue to be difficult kids in spite of our best intervention. So I would always rather undersell. Now I do a better job of saying, using this flexible program, which we're going to be talking about most of the day, and these strategies that I've specifically chosen for your student, then we can expect to see change in the 10 to 40% range. It's not a cure for sure, but we're going to be looking at 2 or 3 target behaviors. And we're going to be tracking data, and we should expect to see change in the 10 to 40% range. So let's say one of the target behaviors that the teacher chosen was headbanging. Now I've set up a program specifically to help decrease the frequency of headbanging. So when I go back to follow up, I may see to the teacher, how's it going? And she may say, he's still really challenging, but he is banging his head a lot less, or she's still difficult, but she is staying in her seat more. So now we are able to see change where it can realistically be expected to occur. And it just has helped so much in getting teachers and parents to stay on board with me when they know I'm not expecting a cure, but I am expecting some change in these particular behaviors. And it just helps so much for me. So I would say, know these statistics, use these statistics. And, every once in a while, you see one of those wow moments where the parent will say, it's just gone. The behavior is just gone. She no longer kicks me while I brush her teeth at night. She no longer protests. And wow, once in a while you'll get that, or you'll see 80 or 90% change. Super exciting. But I have never had anybody frustrated when I undersell and overdeliver. However, people do get frustrated when I oversell and underdeliver. So the best way to keep people with you and hanging in is to undersell, and you hope for overdeliver, but at least you hope that you get realistic in that 10 to 40% range. And that is most common, 10 to 40% change. Okay, so I just want to show you our statistics from the 2 studies I've been involved in. This is a pilot study. This one is available on our website, but we did not have it published because it was a pilot study for us to learn from. This one, we used parents to do the intervention and the data tracking. I never laid hands on these kids. We asked the parents to choose a target behavior that they had reason to believe was rooted in their child's sensory processing issues. And then we taught them how to track data for 7 consecutive days on that specific target behavior. Day 8, they implemented the program that I designed based on the sensory assessment. And then they immediately began data tracking for 14 days. So the entire study was 21 days in length from start to finish. So it's short-term change that we're seeing, which is exciting because it doesn't take long to see change in the majority of kids where change is going to be expected. So in this column, you'll see how many parents chose a behavior that fits under that main topic. So 11 chose issues of emotional overresponsiveness. In most cases, those are meltdowns, 7 with resistance to the activities of daily living, like one little guy who kicked his mama every night during toothbrushing. 4 who had issues falling asleep or staying asleep. 3 who were impulsive. 2 with poor attention to task. 1 little girl who kept her mouth open while eating. We actually saw no change there. Looking back, it probably wasn't a sensory issue since we saw no change. It probably was more of an oral motor issue, but we had already said that the parents could choose the behavior. And then 1 little guy who did a lot of pressure to his jaw with his fist. In the 3rd column, you'll see how many responded with positive change. And in the 4th column, you'll see the average percentage of change in a positive direction. So for example, we saw 42% change in the reduction of emotional overresponsiveness, or it could be stated a 42% in reduction in either length or intensity of meltdowns. There were a lot of options for data tracking depending on the behavior and the nature of the behavior. So you'll see some behaviors yielded better responses than others. Like attention to task, we only saw 11% change. I was not surprised by that number. I am always more excited when teachers or parents choose a target behavior like meltdowns, because I know there's a lot more I can do with a sensory diet to impact meltdowns. There's less that I can do with impacting attention to task. Part of that is because we were using a holistic intervention approach, meaning we were using sensory strategies proactively, but we were also putting reactive strategies such as rewards and undesirable consequences in place for this study. Now, when we are talking about something like a meltdown, I'm able to support these kids by meeting their sensory needs, but I'm also going to follow through with rewards and consequences for appropriate behavior during a routine or a task. And that helps to get better responses. When we're looking at something like attention to task, if I have a true brain-based attention deficit disorder, all of the rewards and consequences in the book are not likely to change the amount of time that I can attend to a task. So what we're seeing with 11% change is probably change in response to the sensory strategies alone, without the added benefit the rewards and consequences may have made in some of these other behaviors. So that's just a theory that I would like to confirm with studies in the future. Okay, now I want to show you our most recent research study. This one I presented as at the AOTA National Conference last year in Philadelphia, and we're still going for publication. Oh my, it's such a long process. So it may be by the time you watch this, we're close. And so this one we implemented in a school, general ed school, pre-K through 6th grade. All of the kids were either part of the control group or the experimental group, as long as they were in general ed for at least 75% of their day. And we were implementing short, frequent movement breaks according to the schedule that I mentioned earlier. 2 10-minute higher intensity sensory breaks per day, just for ease, 1 in the morning, 1 in the afternoon. And then we taught the teachers how to teach sensory modulation using the BrainWorks tachometer and intervention tools. And then we did provide some specific sensory strategies based on the child's sensory assessment when needed. But because this was general ed intervention, we did not want to single anyone out. So if I could see that this child could benefit from noise reduction headphones, then we put 2 to 4 pair of noise reduction headphones in that classroom. And with Lysol wipes, encourage the teacher to allow everyone to try them out so that there's no stigma associated, but just kind of subtly make sure that this child always has access to the noise reduction headphones. So we did some of that as well. But for the most part, what we're doing is just making movement more accessible in the classroom environment. We use pre and post assessment. So we train the teachers to identify signs and symptoms of sensory processing disorder. And after they had the kids in their class 6 weeks, they made that determination. We sent home consent to evaluate forms to 60 kids in all. We got 50 back signed in return. So on those kids, we had the teacher complete the sensory processing measure and the BASC-2 assessment, which is the behavior assessment scales for children. And these are teacher questionnaires that are standardized. And then we implemented. And That was 10 weeks, and then we did post-assessment on those same 50 children. Half of them were in the control group, half of them were experimental group, but it was classroom-wide intervention. So even though we're only tracking data on 2 to 4 kids in each classroom, the whole classroom received the same intervention because we were hoping teachers would see, in addition to these kids, it also helps these kids. And the questionnaires, we did extensive questionnaires of teachers before and after, and across the board, we saw that to be the case. Okay, now this is the results of the sensory processing measure. Pre and post change in the T-scores is what we're looking at. So those of you who are OTs may be familiar with this, others of you may not, but we are seeing different scales. The first one is social participation, visual processing, auditory processing, touch processing, body awareness, balance and plan, and then planning and ideas here. So the blue is our experimental group. The gray is our control group. We see that the control group actually got worse in a few areas throughout the 10 weeks, which kind of makes sense because if I have an unmet sensory need, I'm probably going to struggle more as the academic demands increase. So these results are good. They're not just overwhelming, but I think the reason they're not overwhelming is because the SPM is a fairly short assessment scale. And so it's going to be less sensitive to change that happens over a 10-week time period. It's a fairly short period of intervention. But it's so good. And I think it's interesting to note our biggest change was in the social participation scale. All we're doing is allowing these kids to move more, essentially. We're doing a couple other things too, but mostly allowing them to move more. And we're changing social skills. I think that's amazing to know. And now let's look at the results of the BASC-2. This, I think, is amazing. The BASC-2 is a much longer assessment, so it's going to make sense that it's more sensitive to change that happens over a fairly short period of time. And we're seeing change in T-scores again between pre and post assessment. And in 2 scales, we made 10-point change in T-scale scores, which is typically taking a child from a level of dysfunction into a level of typically functioning. And that's huge. And those 2 areas of biggest change, adaptability was our very biggest amount of change. And you'll see that the control group actually got a little worse during that same time period. Adaptability is like go with the flow, being able to transition. Atypicality is our next biggest line. That is some of the little oddities that we see in some of our kids. Social skills is big. Functional communication is big, which I think is good for speech therapists to know in particular. Hyperactivity is a pretty big line. Attention problems is a pretty big line. Social problems. So those are some of the areas where we see the biggest change. And really all we're doing is bringing movement to the classroom and teaching kids how to identify their sensory needs. So I think that's amazing that we're able to change some of these areas that are not typically thought to be sensory-based issues just through the addition of movement and sensory opportunities in the classroom. So exciting. Okay. Let's see, what time is it? It is 10:37. You know what? Let's take a 15-minute break now. For those of you who are here live, you're going to have 15 minutes. So, that's hard for my brain to calculate. It's 10:37. About 10:52, I'm going to start speaking again, Eastern time. Okay, see y'all back here soon. Okay, welcome back from break, everyone. And we are now ready to move into talking about assessment. How do we determine what a person's sensory needs are? Okay. First of all, we are going to zip through the signs and symptoms of sensory modulation disorder. We're not going to spend a lot of time on these because most of these will appear on a good sensory symptoms checklist or a standardized assessment tool. But I just want those of you who may be auditory learners to have the chance to hear them out loud and to know the basics of what we're looking for. We're going to start with the proprioceptive sensory system. And just as a review, this is our sense of where our body parts are in space and in relationship to each other. Proprioceptive receptors are located in joints, muscles, and tendons, and they're activated through movement, force, and pressure. When we talk about proprioceptive input, we often call these heavy work activities or deep pressure activities. So we think about pushing, pulling, lifting, carrying, crawling. Those kinds of activities tend to be intense proprioceptive input. Okay, so when we are talking about signs and symptoms of of proprioceptive processing, we do not have symptoms of over responsiveness to proprioceptive input. And that is because we as a species are not over responsive to proprioceptive input. That's a good thing because this means this is a very safe form of input. You never have to worry about giving somebody too much proprioceptive input. Because we as a species are not over responsive to it. But we do have people who seem to not be able to get enough of it. Sensory cravers tend to jump and bump and crash into things on purpose. They might smell like saliva all day because they always have their shirt collar in their mouth for oral proprioceptive input or teething other things. Stomping and toe walking are often signs of seeking proprioceptive input. Rough play, maybe even to the point where other children or pets are getting hurt because the kids feel like it feels good to me, so I would assume it would feel good to other people too, when in fact other people do not enjoy that intensity level. And then sometimes a preference for tight clothes or tight-fitting shoes. And then both our cravers as well as our passive underresponders often have difficulty grading movements, like they may use excessive force, they pick up a juice box and the contents squirt all over the place, or they accidentally slam doors, or they move a chair from the desk to the floor with a big slam, or they break the crayons and pencils often, those kinds of things. The vestibular system we already talked about this morning, semicircular canals, and it ultimately ends up giving information to our brain about where we are in relationship to gravity. We do have all three types of modulation issues showing up in this sensory system. Sensory seekers crave motion. They like to spin and jump and be upside down. They may rock their body while they're sitting. Our passive underresponders often have low muscle tone. They just look kind of loosely put together. They slump and slouch and lean on things, poor body awareness and poor motor skills, because if I don't know where I am in relationship to gravity, it's going to be hard for me to move my body in a coordinated manner. Over responders avoid swings and heights and anything where their feet have to come off the ground. You see this start very early sometimes, where daddy may throw the baby in the air and the baby stiffens up and screams. These kids often end up being clingy and sedentary, because if I don't know where I am in space, but I cling on to you, at least I know where you are in space, and that helps me feel more grounded. And sometimes you'll see that kids who are over responsive to vestibular input cry anytime their head has to be tilted backwards, as in hair washing. Now, many times when we hear that kids hate bathing, we assume it's tactile over-responsiveness, and sometimes it is because that is a very tactile time. But if you're able to observe or ask more questions and find out that they really do okay during the majority of bathing, it's only when we go to wash their hair that it becomes an issue. Often that's a vestibular issue because sometimes kids who are over-responsive to vestibular input use vision to help them know exactly where they are in the world. And when you take them here, they feel like they're falling off the side of the planet. So that's best treated from a vestibular standpoint. In the interoceptive sensory system, our over-responders may not dress appropriately for the weather or remove their coat when they're hot. My own daughter did this. She was kind of funny. My quirky one. She used to leave a tight-fitting jacket, like a hoodie. She liked the tight-fitting ones because it gave compression to her sensory system. She'd leave it zipped all the way up to her neck. And even when it was hot outside, like we lived in Texas and Mississippi when she was little, and she'd be red-faced and sweating, and it literally didn't even occur to her to take off her jacket. I had to teach her, when you feel like your armpits are a little wet, it's time to take off your jacket. It just didn't occur to her. Really interesting. These kids are often difficult to toilet train because they're not aware that they need to go. Often we'll see elimination issues like encoparesis, which becomes a very extreme form of constipation, develop in kids who are under-responsive to interoceptive awareness. Apparent lack of appetite or thirst. Some kids they can be tested for everything under the sun, but for whatever reason, they don't have an appetite. And I think it's this interoceptive under-awareness. I've seen it in my own and in other kids that I've worked with as well. We feel that this may be tied to sudden infant death syndrome. In fact, babies who die of SIDS are found to have very low levels of serotonin, and that's probably what makes them under responsive to aspects of their environment like poor airflow and more. And now that we have the Back to Sleep campaign in place since 1984, we have babies who probably at one time would have been at high risk for SIDS who have now survived infancy and toddlerhood, but continue to show us these signs of under responsiveness to interoception, which is interesting. And a lot of sleep issues I really feel like are rooted in interoceptive under awareness as well. Over responsiveness to interoceptive input we see with the kids who, they appear really dramatic, like kids who act like they're in pain when they get out of a cold tub. They're shivering and they're screaming, I'm so cold. We all feel a little cold, but those kids who really are over dramatic about it, it's kind of experienced as painful by their brains. Or interestingly, about this time of year, it's not happening here in Michigan yet, but in some states, they're experiencing like their very first really hot day of the season. And I get emails often this time of year when that happens, where people will say, my daughter, she goes outside and she acts like her skin is literally on fire. And the reality is, if she's over responsive to this type of input, she probably feels like her skin is literally on fire. Hopefully she gets used to it as the season progresses. But you see, changes in seasons can be hard for these kinds of kids. In the tactile system, our under responders want to touch everything. They're unaware of light touch. These are the kids who will come back from the cafeteria with spaghetti sauce all over their face or thick mucus about to run into their mouth, and it doesn't occur to them to wipe it because they don't feel it. Or these are the kids, they always have twisted clothing, or, they just look kind of ragamuffinish, they're not put together real well. And it's just because they're unaware of those subtle things, or the buttons may be off. And most of us would feel that, and they just don't. These kids often mouth everything. That's because we have more tactile receptors in our mouths than anywhere else in our bodies. So if I'm not getting enough information about it from my fingers, if I bring it to my mouth, I can get more information about that. We only expect this to be a sensory issue if they're developing at a higher level than 18 months of age. If they're functioning below that, then mouthing objects is just a developmental issue. All the sensory strategies in the world will not make that go away. But if they're functioning above that level and they're still bringing everything to their mouths, then it's likely that it's a sensory issue that can be treated effectively from sensory-based intervention. These under-responsive kids often appear to have a high pain tolerance. These are the kids, they fall off their bike, they're bleeding, they just jump up, they're ready to go again. A lot of these kids that I work with, they don't mind shots, they don't mind strep tests. It's kind of fun for them, in fact, because it's intense and they feel it. One little girl I know, she gets kind of excited about getting her vaccines every year, which is just kind of very unique. These kids often, it's not uncommon, at least, for them to be nail biters, skin pickers, and that's just because it's an intense form of tactile input. Now, sometimes what you'll see is that anxiety can accompany this. You see an anxious person who resorts towards something they like, and they like deep tactile input, so they become skin pickers or they become nail biters in an attempt to help them cope with the anxiety. And it's because the same neurochemicals that are present when we are anxious are also present when we're having an over-responsive reaction. So the same strategies will still be helpful. And therefore, affect is your best friend in figuring out what do they need and how do we treat it. Sometimes you may think, I think it's actually anxiety. That's okay. The same strategies will be helpful. I think it's actually hyperactivity. That's okay. The same strategies may be helpful. So again, just use affect to help you figure out what could be contributing to that. Poor fine motor skills. This is because if I can't feel the objects well in my hand, it's going to be hard for me to be coordinated with them. Our over responders to tactile input don't like messy play, like finger painting, tactile bends, craft projects where they make it glue on themselves. They're often distressed by the activities of daily living, like toothbrushing, hairbrushing, nail clipping, face washing. They often avoid light touch and overreact to unexpected touch. These kids are often our picky eaters. Picky eating can be due to a lot of things, but most often it's tactile over responsiveness. We'll talk about picky eating more later as well. And over responders to tactile input also are our kids who tend to have a lot of clothing issues, like kids who refuse to wear underwear, or kids who only want to wear jeans, or only want to wear leggings and will never wear jeans. Things like that are pretty common among these kids. In the auditory realm, our under responders often don't respond to their name being called, or they say what a lot. And it's not that they don't hear you, it's just that they need that repetition of information to help them process the input. These kids often make their own noises a lot. It might be or whistling, or something strange, or just that excessive talking or scripting that we see in some of our kids. Now you'll notice that symptom appears in both columns, both for under responders and over responders. That is because they use it for different reasons. Under responders tend to make their own noises a lot to help them reach that threshold. So they tend to do it when the environment's calm and quiet, or when they're a little bit bored, in an attempt to help them reach that auditory threshold. Over responders make their own noises because my noises help me tune out your noises. So over responders tend to make their own noises a lot when the environment's noisy, when the teacher's talking, when they're trying to override something that's distressing to them. So you need to think about the when and the why are they making their own noises, and that will help you determine if it might be a symptom of under or over responsiveness. Under responders are often oblivious to where sound is coming from, and they tend to like everything loud because that helps them reach that threshold more quickly. Over responders are distracted by background noises, like the sound of air cycling on and off, or hair dryers in another room, toilets being flushed somewhere. Those are common fears that generate that fight or flight response. These over responders often cry and cover their ears a lot, and they often ask people to be quiet because they perceive them as being too loud. In the visual system, our under responders have poor visual perceptual skills, difficulty learning to discriminate similar letters and shapes. They may lose their place when reading or copying, especially if they're going from board to paper. They fatigue quickly with schoolwork because it just takes a lot of mental effort to stay on track visually. Our over responders often cry and cover their eyes and avoid eye contact. They're often easily distracted by visual stimuli, which is what a lot of early childhood classrooms are full of, which can be difficult. They have difficulty keeping their eyes focused, and they may have some physiological symptoms like watery eyes and headaches as well. In the gustatory system, which is taste, it's hard because the mouth actually has 4 different types of receptors. It has gustatory, which is taste. It has proprioceptive receptors, which give us information about food quality, like really chewy or really smushy. Tactile receptors, which give us even more information about food quality and texture. And interoceptive receptors that tell us whether the food is hot or cold. So picky eaters may be responding to any of those things. People who bring everything to the mouth, it could be proprioceptive, it could be taste, it could be tactile. So because of that, it's hard for us to isolate gustatory issues. So we're really just going to generalize for the purpose of today and call them oral issues. In general, oral under responders chew on everything. Again, we can only assume that to be a sensory-based system if they're functioning above 18 months of development. These kids often are droolers because they're not feeling the saliva pooling that should trigger a swallow. They tend to like lots of condiments and really intense flavors, like they drown everything in ketchup or ranch or hot sauce, those kinds of things. These kids or under responders can be picky eaters too. They can have a very short food list, but if you see that the foods on their food list are really salty, really spicy, really sweet, it's probably that their food list is short because they only like highly seasoned foods, and that's because they're under responsive. Over responders, though, it's more common to see picky eating associated with over responsiveness. These kids often prefer a bland diet, or what we sometimes refer to it as the khaki diet: chicken nuggets, potato chips, French fries, and crackers. Everything's kind of in that same color, taste, texture scheme. That's a pretty common diet for these kids. They often resist toothbrushing and dental work, and they gag easily, where they might say, I'm going to gag if you make me eat these peas, and they actually do. So you tend not to want to serve peas again. Olfactory, this is our sense of smell. Our under-responders have poor odor discrimination, which isn't usually a big deal. But they often want to smell everything. And that's because if I'm not getting that input from the environment, if I bring everything here, maybe I'll get more information about what's happening in the environment. And sometimes they'll fail to notice noxious odors, which again isn't usually a big deal, but it can play a role in things like safety, like smelling fire or smoke in the air. And it can play a role in toilet training too. Like sometimes we think, I get it that you may not be able to feel that you're wet in that diaper, but can you not smell it because the rest of us can, and that they really are at a disadvantage if they can't feel it or smell it. Over-responders are bothered by smells others may not even notice. They talk about smell a lot. We'll hear these kids, what do I smell? Do you smell that? I love that smell. I hate that smell. Just a lot of the smell-oriented conversation. And food choices are known to be affected by smells as well. One research study looked at taking picky eaters into a fried chicken restaurant. I believe it was Kentucky Fried Chicken, in fact, because the smell of fried chicken is almost universally acceptable in our culture. And they showed that while that was the pervasive smell in the environment, these picky eaters ate more of other foods as well, not just the chicken. So that was interesting. I tried that with my own picky eater and did not see results, but it may be worth trying in some cases. We do need to think about this component for many of our kids. Like, one day this week we made roasted Brussels sprouts for dinner, and it stinks. But most of us know, even though I don't like the smell, I like the taste, and so we can override that. But for our kids who are over responders, they may truly not be able to override that, and so they will not want to eat anything on their plate that day. This can be something to think about in the cafeteria too, when there's so many smells going on, as well as lights and sounds and activity. So cafeterias can be a very difficult place for over-responders, and the olfactory would just be one component of that. Okay, this list is in reality very long, but we can summarize by saying that most of these kids are going to struggle socially. Difficulty interpreting body language and facial expression. Lots of personal space issues are common. Either I have a huge personal space bubble and you better not enter it, or I have no respect for your personal space. You see both extremes with these kids. With many of these kids, we see poor concentration and poor attention to task. That's because neuro researchers can tell us that 80% of our brains are devoted to nothing more than taking in incoming sensory information and deciding how you're going to respond to it. And if that's not working so well for your brain, and you have to end up devoting 85, 90, 95% of your brain to figuring out what's happening at a sensory level, then you just have nothing left over for paying attention to what your teacher is saying or attending to the task at hand. These kids, in particular, are over-responders, tend to be fussy, moody, irritable, angry, and aggressive. Our over-responders in general are not our happy-go-lucky kids because everything's too much for them. Okay, now, knowing that SPD is a therapeutic diagnosis only at this time, it leads us to some difficulty regarding billing, right? We have to be creative for those of you who are in settings where billing takes place. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this because most of you have already probably figured out what needs to happen. There are the DSM-5 is what we're currently using for billable diagnostic codes. And typically, many of our kids with SPD are often lacking in coordination. Many of them are often developmentally delayed. Then there's kind of some generic codes in here regarding development. So we can usually find a code that applies for most of our kids. The one group of kids who I struggle with the most in the clinic are my sensory craving kids. Many of those kids are crazy coordinated. So it's hard for me to justify one of these codes for a kid who's scoring great on the Brunix or the Peabody, right? So it can be tricky for our sensory cravers, and those are the ones who I feel like are often falling through the cracks if they don't have any other diagnoses to fall back on. The CPT is what we're using for billing for increments of time. There is a code for sensory integration techniques. A nationwide study showed that although 56% of therapists who use that code are reimbursed, that means 44% are denied. So I've always worked in settings where we just stay away from that code. Usually, I can feel good about using codes for activities of daily living because I'm always integrating that into my session, and it's always my end goal. My end goal is not that they can tolerate vestibular input. My end goal would be that they could tolerate the head position changes inherent in getting dressed in the morning. I may not even write it like that. I would probably say that Julia will get dressed without signs of distress in less than 8 minutes in 4 out of 5 days, something like that. So I'm usually framing it in sense of the desired behavior, and I don't even have to mention the sensory issues that are playing a role in that. Therapeutic activity is a catch-all, reimbursed at a slightly lower rate sometimes, but it is certainly a safe code. Self-care, development of cognitive skills to increase attention, memory, and problem solving is often applicable as well. So we usually have codes that we can safely choose from and ethically choose from, even if we feel like the true diagnosis is SPD. Okay, so how do we even know if SPD is contributing to this child's issues? I would say start with looking at what other diagnoses they already come to you with. If any of these diagnoses appear on their medical file or their educational file or the IEP or from parent report, it's likely that they also have some degree of sensory modulation disorder because of the extensive overlap that we see between these diagnoses and sensory modulation disorder. ADHD, we've already talked about this a little bit, how ADHD and sensory craving are so similar that it's very hard for us to know for sure which diagnosis we're seeing until we give it a try. Give the sensory approach a try and see if we can make a significant difference. If we can't, then I'm not at all hesitant to say to the parent, in your child's case, a sensory approach does not seem to be helpful. You may want to discuss medications with your doctor, something like that. Or refer them to a counselor, somebody who could help get closer to that accurate diagnosis. But because we know that even if it is truly ADHD, there's such a high level of overlap between ADHD and SPD that our sensory diet plan is fairly likely to help somewhat, even if it's not necessarily enough. Autism and sensory modulation disorder just almost always go hand in hand. And we talked about a fairly consistent pattern for those kids of over-responsiveness to the far sensory systems and under-responsiveness to the near sensory systems. Genetic disorders like Down syndrome. Now, when I am working with children with Downs, I do want to assess their sensory needs and I do address their sensory needs. But I will say I'm less likely to see those wow responses from a sensory standpoint with those kids. And I think it's because some of what is driving what appear to be sensory-based behaviors may not actually be sensory in nature. For example, many kids with Down syndromes do a lot of jaw clenching and teeth grinding. And so I often think they must need a lot of oral proprioceptive input. So I give them the chewy P's and Q's or an oral vibrator, a deep pressure manually. And often it doesn't seem to help that much. They may like the oral motor toys, but I'm never able to satiate that need. It never seems to reach a threshold. And so it doesn't mean that I won't use those tools, but I may know that I'm not necessarily impacting sensory modulation with the use of those tools. I think some of the jaw clenching and tooth grinding that we see to be common in kids with Downs could be an attempt to elicit muscle tone because they're low tone. So I may still give them the chewy P's and Q's because it will protect their tooth enamel. That's better than having them grind their own teeth away. But I may just give them those tools knowing that it's not necessarily a sensory need I'm meeting. I'm using them for a different purpose there. So I may not have the same expectations for some of those behaviors. Traumatic brain injury kind of similar here, where not everything that appears sensory is sensory. So this is where we really just know we need to have a lot of tools in our tool belt. One of my favorite instructors in graduate school often said, if your only tool is a hammer, you'll treat everything like a nail. And the older I get, the more wisdom I see in that, where our sensory strategies and our sensory-based intervention is one tool, but we need to have a lot of other tools in our tool belt as well. And this becomes evident when we treat these complicated kids. I saw a kid in multiple settings because he was actually the son of one of my friends, and he fell out of a second-story window when he was 2, landed on his frontal lobe, massive damage. No life signs in the helicopter, but he did live. And after he was in an induced coma for quite some time, and then after they brought him out of that, he very quickly started walking because the motor cortex remained intact. But he'd walk and he moaned and he groaned and he cried, and he'd pick up any random thing he could find and bite down on it so hard. His teeth were chipping and objects were getting broken. And I saw him in a daycare setting. His germs were on everything. So it was a hygiene issue too. And I kept thinking, man, he needs so much oral input. But I was giving him so much oral input, and I could never satiate that need. There was never a time when he voluntarily stopped chewing on anything. If you can never satiate, it's probably not a sensory need. It's just a little clue for you. He liked it, but I could never satiate that need. And even though he liked it, he was still kind of moaning and groaning while he was chewing. So that's kind of a sign to me. I don't think it's sensory. So I just took a step back and started thinking about what else it could be. And when you think about the amount of cranial damage that occurred and the scarring that's happening as both his cranium and his cranium and his brain heal, so brain scarring and structural scar tissue as the bones join back together again, that's got to be painful. And he did appear to be in pain. So I just had very basic craniosacral training, but I thought I'm going to give it a try. So I tried some basic things like gentle jaw traction and some skull manipulation. And it was interesting because he just would melt in my arms, and that told me that's what he's going for. It's not about the oral proprioceptive input. He's chewing to try to relieve pressure. That's kind of common, by the way, in lots of cases, like people with TMJ are trying to relieve pressure, things like that. So we're trying different jaw positions to give some relief there. And I think that's what he was doing. Now, it didn't have a long-lasting effect. I might do this, he'd get up and he'd start moaning again, but at least it helped me get closer to what he was really needing and knowing that that was more of a pain-based response rather than a sensory-based response. So, if you're trying sensory-based intervention and it doesn't seem to be helping, you can't reach a threshold, you can't satiate, you're not seeing adaptive responses, never hesitate to take a step back and think about your other tools and what else might be worth trying. Environmental deprivation. Here, I'm primarily thinking about kids who are born in overseas orphanages where they're receiving really substandard care. Many kids are growing up in pack and plays. And I saw one little boy for a couple years who had been adopted from a Romanian orphanage at 14 months of age. And prior to his adoption, he lived in a pack and play. The workers would bend over to change his diapers, they'd prop his bottles. So he had incredible environmental deprivation. In response, he became a very extreme over responder. Some kids become seekers. It just depends on their genetic predisposition combined with environmental factors. He had such extreme over responsive reaction that I really suspect he had a genetic inclination. In fact, researchers have found a gene for over-responsiveness. So we feel like in some people, this is a genetic inborn trait. I suspect he had that, and then it was compounded by the fact that he was never touched. In fact, it's possible that he was never touched because the orphanage workers figured out he was happier when he wasn't touched. So it may not be that they weren't loving or kind. It might be that they realized pretty early on he didn't like to be touched. And you know what? My first daughter, just like that. She was one of the most over-responsive kids I've seen to date. She did not want to be touched as a child, cried during feedings. She was happiest when you left her alone. And had I not had the knowledge and education that I have, A, it was hard to bond with her. And B, I probably would have left her alone more because she was happiest that way. But knowing what I knew, I thought, you know what, child, you are going to be touched and held, even if you don't want to be touched and held. and I would give her firm pressure input to make it as tolerable as possible. I'd swaddle her, but I persisted. And with less knowledge and less education and less persistence, you can easily see how there would be a very unstable parent-child bond and how they would end up just getting ignored a lot because that's how they seem happiest. So this little boy probably it was twofold issue that caused his extreme over responsiveness. Anyway, he had to be sedated to get back to the States. He bonded with his adoptive parents remarkably fast, but if anybody else came within his very huge space bubble, he literally vomited because the idea of you coming too close to him caused extreme overload. He also vomited anytime he had to be outside on a windy day, and we were in a windy city. So car to clinic, car to home, vomit, vomit, vomit. He had failure to thrive. It was a long course of intervention, but by the time he went to kindergarten, he was functional and could tolerate a fair amount of sensory input. Really interesting kid. Okay, neurological disorders like cerebral palsy. We don't often think of these kids as having sensory modulation issues, but almost all of them do. And it's because of their physical limitations that don't allow them to receive the same types of sensory input that their typically developing peers receive. When we had our own daughters who were 3 and 1, we just kind of accidentally became foster parents through this weird course of events. And we had this little boy who came to live with us who was 1, and he was shaken by his mama at 11 months of age. So interestingly, he was born with cerebral palsy. He was my patient. And then he was shaken. So it compounded the neurological damage or added to the neurological damage. So I saw him before and I saw him after. Interesting case. The main shaken baby issues impacted his retina detached. So he had low vision. Afterwards also, and then the CP seemed to get a little bit worse in some aspects. But anyway, he's the same age as my middle daughter, so they functioned very much like twins for the year that he lived with us full time. And it was just really fascinating to watch how their development mirrored and how they're veered. But this really hit home to me in seeing I need to make sure he experiences the same types of sensory input that she is able to experience. When she became vertical, I want him to be vertical because I want him to experience the world in a vertical manner at that age appropriate time, because our brain has windows of opportunity when those are best processed, and it's at the age appropriate time. But I stayed home full time that year, but I couldn't always be there for him. I had 2 other kids. None of them were potty trained. They were all little. It was a busy year. And so I couldn't always be right there for him. And what I saw emerge is common for these kids. He has better use of his arms than his legs. He has diplegic cerebral palsy. So he could pivot on his arm. So his world was kind of this little 2-foot radius if I couldn't be right there for him. So he couldn't do a whole lot. And when I wasn't there attending to him, he did what he could do, which ended up being repetitive play. He ended up engaging in things that he could do over and over and over and over again. And one thing that he really loved was to be near a door. And he'd be up on his elbows and he'd flick the door shut, and he didn't have enough strength to make it latch, so it would fly back open. And I think he liked the visual and the auditory, and he just loved it. He could do it for a long time. In fact, he was about like 18 months of age when I did this weird little experiment. Only a therapist would do this, right? But one day I just thought, I wonder how long he could do that mindless activity. So I set him up in front of the door and I just let him go for it. And I watched my watch. 1 hour and 45 minutes. He was perfectly happy just flicking the door like that. And that's an incredible length of time. And you can see that these kids are easy to ignore if left to their own vices often when they start engaging in something like that. Not just neurological disorders, but also things like autism, where they like to stack their blocks for hours on end or line up cars. And they're happy. So a lot of parents who don't know any different will think, well, as long as they're happy, then I'm going to let him keep engaging in that. But what I tell parents is, it's not that what he's doing is wrong, but it's just what he's missing out on while he's engaging in that repetitive play for great lengths of time. His brain is missing out on things that could really be helpful developmentally. And, although I let my little Billy do that 1 hour and 45 minutes for my experiment, that I certainly, that was not common. I wanted to intervene. I wanted to give him the appropriate stimulation, to give his little brain optimum chance to develop. So we just really want to be encouraging parents and teachers and daycare people to think about, what are other kids their age doing, and how can we get them to experience the same forms of sensory input as much as possible. Most kids with cerebral palsy end up being sensory cravers because they want more input than what their physical limitations allow them to have. So that's a pretty common pattern there. It may not have started out as a sensory processing issue, but it becomes one because of their limitations. And then other sensory impairment, like vision impairment or hearing impairment, because our brains are designed to process information from 8 sensory systems. And if one of those is cut off from us, we will typically seek additional input from the remaining sensory systems. I saw one little girl in the schools who was born completely blind. And when I saw her, she was like second, third, fourth grade age range during those years, and she was incredibly smart. So she had dual diagnosis, gifted and visual impairment. And so she did go to the gifted program, but that was only like 2 hours a week. So most of the time she was in general ed, and she'd just get bored. The teacher said it once, she's got it. Why does the teacher keep talking? And whenever she'd get bored, she'd start doing this eye poking behavior. And I think she was probably like getting kickback from the optical nerve or something. But in the process, she was scarring up her eyelids, and, they'd get infections. And so we just, first of all, because she's smart, I was just really direct with her that, first of all, it's hard for other people to look at that because it looks painful, and it's, you have open sores on your eyelids, and, just helping her understand that that's kind of undesirable to people visually. And then secondly, it makes her at risk for infection. So we just talked about why we need this behavior to go away, and what can we do to give you all alternate forms of stimulation when you are feeling bored. So we did some things like put Dyson on her desk with some fidgets. That way they couldn't roll away. And that way she'd always have something to fiddle with. I gave her alternative seating so she could get some movement, things like that. But we also had to use rewards to motivate her to change. So for every 10 minutes that she didn't engage in eye poking, she got a token. And then after so many tokens, she could exchange it for a backup reinforcer. And I feel like those kinds of plans, rewards and consequences, are necessary when we don't have sensory strategies that can safely match the intensity of that which they're giving themselves. So, eye poking was this intense. Her fidgets and stuff were about half as intense as that. Now I got to do something to motivate her to accept my less intense strategies as substitutes for her higher intensity strategy that she prefers. And rewards helped motivate her to be okay with my less intense options. Okay, and then any history of trauma or abuse. This is an area that's starting to be researched more and more. We have a clinic at Western Michigan University that treats kids. Their therapy departments treat kids who are in the foster care system in our city. And some of the research has found that a really high percentage of kids who experience trauma in their first year of life end up with easily recognizable sensory processing disorder. We also see research looking at soldiers coming back from the Middle East with post-traumatic stress disorder and how that changes the neurochemistry in the brain. So part of their response is psychological in nature, which is understandable. If you live in the fear of explosions, obviously loud noises will cause you to startle. But we're also seeing that it's changed the way they respond to all forms of sensory input, or at least other forms of sensory input too. So we're seeing they're really best addressed through a combination of cognitive behavioral therapy as well as sensory-based intervention to help that brain get back and reset to its norm through neurochemical changes. So really interesting how all of this is tied together. We even see studies, for example, on girls who have been sexually abused, and that over time, it changes the neurochemistry in the brain when it happens over a period of time, not necessarily an isolated event. And it changes the way the brain responds to sensory input. Some of them become seekers of certain dangerous forms of sensory input. It even kind of helps explain promiscuity among that population. It doesn't make sense cognitively why they would become promiscuous, but they become seekers for that really intense form of input. Whether they liked it or not, it becomes kind of a brain need for that high rush of dopamine and so forth. So even if we take these kids out of abusive situation and we're meeting their psychological needs, we still have to recognize their brains now process sensory input different, and they need other intense forms of sensory input. So finding the best results, treating kids from that holistic approach. Okay, if you see those diagnoses we just talked about, I would at least pull out a good sensory symptoms checklist, because most of those kids are going to have some form of sensory modulation disorder going on as well. Furthermore, there are cases where you think he doesn't have any of those other labels, but he is still quirky, and I want to find out if sensory modulation disorder is part of that quirkiness. And so to help you get closer to that, look at family history. We see there's at least a 50% chance that a child who's over-responsive will also have a parent who's an over-responder. We don't see we are less well researched on the other forms of modulation disorders as far as statistics with genetics, and but I see it on an informal level a fair amount. So get to know the parents, ask what they do for a living. Sometimes you see, I see why you are the way you are, because it is that genetic link. Issues with activity level, and this is either extreme. Sometimes I see kids with autism and their parents will say, he was the easiest baby in the world. Well, you know what? Babies aren't supposed to be that easy. It's normal for them to cry up to 2 hours a day. And if they barely cry at all, maybe it's because they're happy to sit and watch the fan spin for hours on end. And that's not necessarily a good thing, right? So either extreme can be indicative of an issue, either kids who never stop moving or kids who never move, Social interactions, again, we're looking for extremes. Kids who never stop talking or kids who never want to interact at all. Self-care issues, we see this more among over-responders. Poor frustration tolerance as well, more common with over-responders. And attention issues we see with both over and under responders. So these are some red flags that make you think, even though he doesn't have any of those other labels, I'm still going to have the teacher or the parent fill out a good checklist to see if modulation could be part of the issues. Okay. Excuse me. Okay, so now we're going to talk about different options for assessment. We're going to start with talking about the standardized tools. Most of these are only going to be available to you if you're an OT or a PT. If you're not an OT or PT, hang in there with me and we will talk about tools that are available for everybody who is here today. The SIPT is still considered to be the gold standard for diagnosing sensory processing disorder. The SIPT stands for Sensory Integration and Praxis Tests. It's only standardized for kids between the ages of 4 years and 8 years, 9 months. It's lengthy, it's costly. It requires the therapist to go through a 3-week certification course. So it's not accessible to many of us. I was actually fortunate enough to be working in a clinic where we all became trained in the use of the SIPT back in 1999 and 2000, and I became certified. Now, I used it in that clinic once or twice, but honestly, I've never used it since. So there are times when I would like to be able to use it, but it just hasn't been available. And sometimes I feel like for what we're here to talk about today, which is a sensory diet approach, I really feel like the SIPT is more information than we need because it's looking at motor planning and more. So that is still an option. However, it is being phased out, and I see that Kathleen is already aware of that. The EASY is coming soon, and the EASY It's evaluation of AIRS sensory integration, I think is what that stands for. And I think it's slated to be released in 2019. If you know differently, Kathleen, please feel free to chime in. This is going to be more usable by the masses, and we're excited about it. And it's going to give us more information about sensory modulation specifically than I feel like the SIP did, and be more appropriate for more kids too, wider age range, less restriction on other disabilities and so forth. So we are looking forward to that, and I'm excited to hear more about it. But I think we are still at least a year out from that, but know that that's on the horizon. And then other options that are available to you at this point in time. The first two are the most commonly used right now, the sensory profile and the sensory processing measure. These are both standardized caregiver questionnaires. The sensory profile has been around the longest, since about 2002. The sensory profile, Winnie Dunn is the primary author of this tool, and she does use different language and terminology than we're using today. However, if you're a little bit more seasoned, like I am, you've been around the block a time or two, I can still easily look at the results of the sensory profile and fit it in with the continuum and what we're talking about today with our sensory modulation terms. So I still find it to be a very helpful tool, even though overall I use language more in line with Lucy Jane Miller. But it's good. It is standardized for different age ranges. There's one for birth to 6 months of age, 1 to 7 to 35 months of age, one for ages 3 to 14, and one for 14 and beyond. The one for 14 and beyond can be filled out by the individual themselves if they are cognitively able to do so. And there is the original format that's most appropriate to be filled out by the home caregiver, a parent typically, and then the school companion form that's most appropriate to be filled out by the teacher. It is lengthy. It often takes 30 to 45 minutes for a caregiver to fill out. It's lengthy for you to score. There is some scoring software, and there's an online scoring program called Q Global. Q, just the letter Q, dash global. It's available from Pearson Clinical. It is, you pay, I think, about $1.50 to $2 per assessment to use. It's so worth it to me. I would pay for it out of my pocket if I use this very often, because it does all of the scoring for you, and it writes up a nice little narrative as well, helping to explain the results. So just know that's an option for you. Now, there is a short form of the sensory profile too. I use that a fair amount as well. It gives me enough information in most cases to come up with what I need. The scoring site, I believe, I'm kind of rusty on this because it's been a little while. Beverly, I'm going to type it in here. Pearson Clinical. Can't remember the exact website, but if you look for Pearson Clinical, or you know what, just type Q Global Scoring for sensory profile. I think you'll be able to get to that too if you just type that into your search box. Okay. And so know that's an option for you for scoring. I like the sensory profile. I think it gives me a lot of really in-depth information. I come away knowing for sure, what are they over-responsive to? What are they under-responsive to? And that's what I need to know in order to design my sensory diet. So it's still probably my tool of choice when I go for a standardized assessment. The sensory processing measure is a little bit newer. It's been around since about 2007, though, so it's also aging. They have the SPMP for preschoolers, which was released a few years later. That one is for ages 2 through 5 who have not started kindergarten. And then the original SPM is for ages 5 who are in kindergarten through ages 12. There is a infant and toddler version in the works. I'm not sure on expected release date of that. But it's coming. And then I believe they're eventually making plans for one to work for people over the age of 12 as well. But right now, if you're looking at younger than 2 or older than 12, the sensory profile is your only option. But between 2 and 12, you could choose either the profile or the sensory processing measure. The sensory processing measure is really nice too. I kind of like them both for different purposes. The sensory processing measure is much quicker for the caregiver to fill out, typically about 10 minutes. It's very quick and easy for you to score. It comes up with this nice little visual graph showing you what areas they're doing well and what areas they're struggling in compared to their peers. Let's see, there are different formats. There's one for the home, one for the teacher, and then there's school environments forms that you can give to the bus driver, the lunch lady, the PE teacher, so you can really see how the child processes input from multiple environments of his or her day. So it's good. It's a good tool. The only potential, and it's not even a negative, it's just a difference. If I use the sensory processing measure, I come away knowing whether or not there is an issue. I don't necessarily know if the issue is due to over or under responsiveness. And for the purposes of designing a sensory diet, I have to know what they're over responsive to and what they're under responsive to. So if I use the sensory processing measure, I usually also use a sensory symptoms checklist to give me that information. Now, in reality, you can take your time with the sensory processing measure, and the manual's very good and very comprehensive. So I may go, like in the manual, item 13. This, if the check says always, this is a sign of over responsiveness, something like that. So I can go to the manual to get more of that information if I need to, and it can sometimes be enough for me to come away knowing, okay, these are the areas he's over responsive in, these are the areas he's under responsive in. So just kind of be aware of that when you're determining your assessment. However, the primary author is Diana Henry, and she's much more in line with the language that we're using today. So if you are newer to all of this, I would probably steer you toward the sensory processing measure at this point in time versus the sensory profile. But if you're experienced and you're already familiar with the profile, I think you can definitely get the information you need from that too, even though our language is a little bit different. Okay? So I like both. Now, the next two, Georgia DeGangi was the primary author of both of these. The Test of Sensory Functions in Infants is for the itty-bitty ones, and then the DeGangi-Burke Test of Sensory Integration is for the 3 to 5-year-old population. These are standardized tests. They are not caregiver questionnaires. So sometimes when you want to not involve the parent or the teacher for whatever reason, or you're just also wanting to look at like the motor planning component of sensory processing and more, these are two good options for you for that birth to 5 age range. And you're looking at how the child reacts to certain toys or interacts with things. For example, in the DeGangi-Burke, you're doing things like one of the tests, and I do this in the clinic a fair amount, is you have a dowel rod, and they lay down and you ask them to grab onto the rod with their arms and the legs, and you pick them up like a little monkey, and see if they can co-contract and motor plan to stay attached to that, things like that. So it's kind of given us more information about the apraxia, the motor planning component, a little bit less about modulation, but know that those are there and they are good options to look at sensory processing in general, not so specifically modulation. The sensory integration inventory was designed by Bonnie Handschuh. It's not used very much anymore, but I still use the revised version for individuals with developmental disabilities for kids who are more profoundly physically and or cognitively impaired. Because if I am looking at a nonverbal, non-ambulatory child, some of the things on the profile or the processing measure just don't even really make sense in terms of that child's abilities. But this is it's just a checklist. It's not standardized, but there's a nice little paragraph in the manual, and it looks at things like doesn't position self squarely on furniture or flicks objects in front of eyes. And then it gives you a little one paragraph explaining what that behavior may indicate at a sensory level. So once you get done, you have a pretty good idea of this child is needing more of a vestibular input or this child is over responsive to visual. So you can put a sensory program in place accordingly. So that's still my tool of choice for the more profoundly involved individuals. And then last but not least are sensory processing checklists. And there are a wide number of these. If you already have a good sensory processing checklist that you like, I don't really see a reason to change. Most of them just vary in length and layout. But if you don't have access to a good checklist that you like so far, I've created one that you're free to use, and it was included in your materials packet. And it's also printable from our website. Later, when I demonstrate the website, I'll show you how to get to that. So if you want to write on the one that you have included with your materials today, feel free to do so, because you'll be able to print this out anytime in the future, no copyright attached. So just looking at my checklist, I'm a visual person, so I've arranged it such that the symptoms of over-responsiveness are on the left and the symptoms of under-responsiveness are on the right. So I can look at this and quickly determine I'm seeing under-responsiveness in the tactile realm, okay? Now, whenever we're looking at this checklist or any checklist, we always want to remember they are only checklists. You know, the symptoms on here could be sensory, but they could be other things too. So if, you know, our goal is not to think we need to come up with a goal for every check mark on this checklist. That would be a poor use of time and resources. The only real purpose of a checklist is to help us see patterns of responsiveness. And when I'm looking at this child, his pattern is telling me he's under responsive to tactile input. Now, there are a couple of random check marks on here, but I want to keep the bigger picture in mind. This is a child with Angelman syndrome. He is non-ambulatory, he's nonverbal. Now, for example, one check mark is that he startles easily when touched unexpectedly. I understand why the teacher checked that. Because, for example, if you touch Reese on his shoulder and say his name, you get this big reaction because his body works as a unit, you know? Where if I touch a typically developing child on the shoulder and say the name, he might just look at me and say, what? With Reese, I get this whole body flexion response because that's due to his physical disability. So therefore, I'm not going to worry about that. You know, that's not a sensory issue in his case. Clearly, the pattern is showing me he's under responsive to tactile input. Okay. The next page shows proprioceptive and vestibular. And again, we're seeing his pattern shows me he's under responsive to these three forms of input. So when I'm designing a sensory program, I'm going to primarily be implementing alerting strategies with him, right? Now, interestingly, the reason why this one was brought to me was because his teachers felt like he was over responsive to tactile input and were asking for strategies. The reason they were seeing that is because he's non-ambulatory and he's starting to get some flexion contractures in his lower extremities. And the PT is coming in. This is a self-contained school for kids with fairly profound disabilities. So he was getting PT daily with a 15-minute stretching program to reduce the contractures. And the longer that he was on the mat, having his legs stretched, the more he got giggly and wiggly and he pulled up into flexion. And it was really hard to complete the stretching process. So they felt like it was tactile over-responsiveness, which kind of makes sense because the longer he was touched, the more reactive he became. That's how they were seeing it. Something similar was happening on the changing table. He also was a drooler. So often when they changed his diaper, they also changed his shirt. And so he was on the table a while. And the longer he was there, the more he became giggly and wiggly and he pulled up into flexion. And it was hard to complete the hygiene process. I'm going to show you a little video clip of him. And in this video, she's already changed his diaper, and she's just going to take his shirt off and put it back on to show us what happens when he's on the table very long. And so they were thinking tactile over-responsiveness and have already tried appropriate strategies for over-responsiveness without luck, which is also usually a clue that we're not going in the right direction. So before I even went to consult, I had them fill out this checklist, and I'm thinking, actually, I think it's under responsiveness, but let me take a look at what we're seeing. And so this is a little video clip. Now, sometimes when I show videos through GoToTraining, they appear a little bit choppy, and it's just a bandwidth issue. But hopefully, you'll still be able to see enough to see what's going on. Sit up, put it back on. Sit up. Sit up. I am puzzled by that. All right. Ta-da! One thing he really likes is he likes the light touch. Yes. Loves. And see, kids who are truly tactically defensive typically don't like that. I almost think the giggly wiggly behavior is more boredom than tactile defensiveness. Really? I kind of do. Really? By looking at that checklist. Okay. I just used the word boredom because he's probably not a child with like a genetic form of sensory modulation disorder. It's probably like more like my little foster son, who needed more input than what his physical limitations allowed him to get. So, for example, if you think about a typically developing 6-year-old child and me asking him to lay on a mat while I stretch his legs for 15 minutes, most kids wouldn't tolerate it at all. They'd get up and walk away, or at a minimum, they would start talking to me. Reese can't do those things. He does what he can do. The one movement pattern he has down is flexion. So he flexes. And the other thing that he can do is get giggly and wiggly and cute in an attempt to get his caregiver to interact with him. And that's working beautifully for him, right? So he's doing what he can to give himself the input that he needs. I'm sorry, for some reason it didn't go back to my current slide here. So, he's doing what he can to meet his sensory needs. And the giggly wiggly is working for him. He's being cute. She's interacting with him. And so that's working for him. So once we determine that this is really an issue of under-responsiveness rather than over-responsiveness, it changes how we're going to address the issue. He wants more input than what he's getting while he's laying on the mat or being changed. So when the PT came for stretching time, they did a lot of co-treatment anyway. So maybe the speech therapist would be working with switch toys, and as long as he had that to keep his brain engaged, he remained long and loose, and it was much easier to complete the stretching program. On the changing table, actually, we started, if he was just wet, he could stand, and if he can stand, he might as well stand. So if he was just wet, we would stand him in front of the sink, and he could play with the water while, she quickly put on a new diaper. If he was soiled, obviously, they still had to lay him down, but we'd bring in like push-button musical toys and things like that. And as long as his brain was engaged, he remains long and loose, and it's much easier to complete the hygiene process. So that's where the checklist can come in. When it's not clear exactly what's contributing to a tricky behavior, the checklist will help you reason through it. Like, oh yeah, I think he wants more of these kinds of input, and then give you a starting point. So that's where the checklist can be helpful. I will say, in going back to assessment options, the vast majority of time, all I need is the checklist. That's all I need. In fact, when I am a school-based therapist, I prefer to only use a checklist, because sometimes I feel like the results of the sensory profile or the sensory processing measure may open a can of worms that I cannot fully address from an educational therapy standpoint, right? Like if it shows definite differences across the board, and some parents will say, then he needs sensory breaks in the OT room 5 times a week, and you need to be doing one-on-one therapy with him 2 sessions a week. And, it just opens up some of those things that are hard. Like as an educationally based therapist, I may say, yes, he does have these extensive sensory needs, but they are not all impacting his education. I can only focus on the ones that are impacting his education. So most often, I don't have to have a standardized assessment. We're typically not able to qualify a child for therapy based on results of a sensory-based assessment anyway. So I typically find myself only using a standardized assessment when I need to prove to someone there either is a problem or there's not a problem. Sometimes, for example, you have one of those IEP meetings coming up where everyone is not on the same page. Maybe the parents are saying he has sensory issues. The school needs to be addressing his sensory issues. And the teachers are saying, actually, he's doing really well in this environment. Or vice versa, where the teacher is saying, we need something different for this kid. And the parents are saying, what are you talking about? My child's fine. Sometimes in those cases, I will administer the profile. And my first choice is to give one form to home and one to school. And often it helps us all get on the same page where I can say, actually, we are all looking at the same child. And what we're seeing is the difference in the environment. So let's learn from the environment where he's doing well and see how we can take strategies from there to help him do better in the environment where he's struggling. But if everybody's basically on the same page, a checklist is all I need because it tells me what he's over responsive to and what he's under responsive to. And that's what I need to create my sensory diet. So if you don't have to use a standardized form, don't worry about it. And if you're a teacher here today, feel free to use this checklist. We always get into that debate about where does the therapist role begin and where does the teacher's role begin. I feel like the less territorial we are, the better, because we really all want to be working as a team to meet the children's needs. But I also don't feel like we should be passing out checklists willy-nilly and allowing all teachers to make determinations based on the results of the checklist. Even as OTs, we get very little of this in our education, and then we learn more through continuing ed courses. So I feel like if your teacher has been to this course, I feel like you do have what you need to interpret the results of the checklist for the vast majority of kids. There may be times when you see equal numbers of checklists on each side, and you're really going to want to draw in the OT to help you formulate a sensory diet. But if you just want to know in general what's contributing, what are some simple accommodations I could have, I definitely think teachers who are attending this course will have more than enough for the majority of kids to make those decisions. Certainly, if the child has OT already on their IEP, take advantage of that and, ask to collaborate with the OT in developing the sensory diet. But if it's a child who you cannot get OT services for whatever reason, I think the teachers who have attended this course or a similar course should be able to interpret the checklist to be able to make decisions well. So there you go. Okay, we are now ready to start talking about how do we teach self-modulation. This is going to vary a lot depending on the program you choose, depending on the age of the kids who you're teaching. There's a lot of programs already out there, and we're gonna talk about some of those in a few minutes. But most of them are similar in that they start with some type of an analogy, and then they look for teachable moments to make that analogy stick. For example, the ALERT program has been around the longest, and it's the ALERT program for self-regulation. I love it. They talk about how does your engine run? That's the language that we use. Is your engine going really fast and you're about to crash? Is your engine barely trudging along and you need a little push to get going? Or is your engine at that just right speed where you're able to focus on what's most relevant and filter out everything that's less relevant? So I like that analogy, and we kind of built on that analogy with the BrainWorks program that I'll show you in a little bit. Some other therapists use like the Winnie the Pooh analogy. Early intervention therapists tend to be fond of this one, where Winnie the Pooh represents just right, Tigger represents too fast, Eeyore represents too slow. Zones of regulation is another growing program. Zones of regulation is really looking at emotional regulation, but emotional regulation is closely tied to sensory regulation. So there's a lot of overlap. It's a great program too. They use the colors zones, like blue represents slow, sick, not feeling well, sad. Green represents just right. Yellow represents a little escalated. It might be hyper but edgy. It might be angry but still in control. And then red kind of represents meltdown, out of control. And so that, using that zone as an analogy can help kids learn. There's another program called Stick Kids that also teaches sensory modulation. And the analogy is fast like a rabbit, slow like a tortoise, or just right, like this dude that's standing on a scale. So you pick an analogy that works for you, and then you start looking for teachable moments with the kids where you might say, right now, I can tell that your engine's going way too fast. I can tell that because you're rocking in your seat and you won't look at me, and you're bouncing up and down. And then another time I want to try to catch them in the just right zone. And I can say, I can tell right now you're at that just right speed. You're in the BrainWorks yellow zone because you are making good eye contact with me and you're disregarding what's happening across the room. So I want to use those teachable moments to help them know, what does it mean to be just right, And then the next step would be turning it around where I'm saying to him, where do you think you're at right now? Do you think you might be going a little bit too fast? And I'm gauging his feedback, and then I can determine, is he getting it? How close are we to having him understand that and own it? And then the last step of that process will be helping them learn that they can control their current sensory speed with different activities. There are some activities that serve as the brake pedal that help us slow down. And there are other activities that serve as the accelerator pedal that help us get going. So that's kind of that final part of the teaching process, is helping them learn you're in control of your sensory speed. And so no matter what program you choose, those are the general steps you're going to go through. Now, here are some different options for you. The ALERT program was designed to be implemented in general ed, but it's easily adaptable for younger kids and older kids and kids with cognitive impairments. You can go through a training course. Their manual is also super user-friendly, a lot of great ideas. They've also developed some games that help kids learn about modulation and some CDs with songs for modulation. So if you go to alertprogram.com, you'll see everything they have to offer. My Sensory book, this is a great book written by a social worker, Lauren Kirstein, and it's a workbook type program. So there's a lot of it in the book is written for you as the facilitator. It tells you what to say and how to explain things. And then there are some reproducibles in there that you could do group-based intervention. You can kind of pick and choose. You don't have to do it cover to cover. I've used it several different ways, but it does a great job of making that connection between your emotions and sensory input and helping kids learn they can change their emotions through sensory strategies. So it's a great program. Probably, I would say, like bright third graders all the way up through high schoolers could be appropriate for elements and aspects of this program. Sometimes I just pull a couple things from it to help a child learn the basics of what he's struggling with. I have done the program in its entirety twice. The most fun I had with it was when I had a boy on my caseload with bipolar disorder, and he was in 8th grade in a self-contained classroom for kids with behavior disorders. There were 5 kids in this class, and I decided they could all benefit from this program. So I used my direct treatment time with him to do group-based intervention, which counts as direct treatment time, by the way. I used to think I had to be one-on-one with that kid. You do not. As long as you are working on that child's goals, it counts as your direct treatment time with that kid, even if there are others present. And most middle schoolers would rather be part of a group than singled out anyway. So we used this book, and I had plenty in there to do an hour session a week for a whole semester. I could have easily stretched it out to the whole year, but I just started with him the second semester of school. And it was really fun. These were 5 middle school behavior disorder boys. It doesn't get much worse than that. I had no idea what I would get out of them, but they enjoyed it because it's all about being introspective and thinking about what makes you tick, what makes you unique. And they really got in touch with their senses. And he realized that smell was a big trigger for him. We already knew that. He decided whether he liked you or not based on how you smelled. And he was really rude and crude about the stinky middle schoolers around him. But he also realized that smell was a good way for him to decompress. So the teacher's idea was to have the boys develop a calming corner for the classroom upon the conclusion of our program based on what they had learned about themselves. So this boy, knowing the smell worked for him in both directions, it could be good or bad, he asked for votive candles. So I just went to Walmart and got a variety of scents, and I took the wicks out because they were behavior disorder kids, and just gave him the candles without the wicks and in a like a Rubbermaid. And when he went to the calming corner, almost always he would sit in the beanbag and get out those candles, and he would deep breaths to smell them, and he liked the waxy, smooth feel of the candles. More often than not, he could get it together. Another thing that he realized he liked was deep pressure. So sometimes he would go in the calming corner and curl up in the fetal position and ask somebody to put the beanbag and some heavy objects on top of him, and he would cocoon himself in there and could usually de-escalate. We took data on him, and the data showed that the use of the strategies that he learned through this program resulted in the decrease of the escalations that resulted in him getting in trouble by about 55%, which is pretty good. I was really pleased with that. And he just gained such an awareness for some of his triggers and also some of the ways that he could use to calm himself down. Arnie and His School Tools is a really great book written from a little boy's perspective about what's challenging for him in school and the different tools that help him to do his best. So this is a book, if you're implementing sensory equipment or sensory strategies in a classroom for one child to use or for an entire classroom, which is always my first choice so that we don't single anybody out, I would say read this book during circle time or have the teacher read it during circle time. In our most recent study, we had the teachers for pre-K through second grade read this every day during circle time for the last 2 weeks of intervention, or the first 2 weeks of intervention, just so that we start using that language. And that's the language we want to use. Everyone has different tools to help them learn. Some people wear glasses to help them learn. Other people sit on therapy balls to help them learn. So this is a good book to introduce that language, to take the questions about why this equipment and why these strategies are in place for little kids. Tools for Teens is one of Diana Henry's. She has the whole tools series, tools for parents, tools for teachers, tools for pets, tools for, let's see, what else am I missing? Tools for teens, the tools for infants, tools for tots. So the whole tool series, this is a good one. What I really like about this book is that she kind of goes into the science and the neurology so that teenagers understand how they're changing neurochemicals, and it shows the little axon and dendrite, and I love that because I want the kids to understand we're not just playing games. This is what's happening. We're changing the chemistry in your brain, so it's really good for that. Whenever I'm working with older kids, like general ed types of middle and high schoolers who have sensory issues, I either use Tools for Teens or my sensory book. I tend to use my sensory book more when I feel like there are some sensory issues, but I think there's also something else, some behavior, some emotional issues, because this one is a little bit more holistic in nature. Tools for Teens is best if you think it's mostly sensory processing disorder, because this book comes from more of like a purist perspective overall, but both are great. And then last but not least are visual sensory diet tools like BrainWorks. When kids are developmentally and age appropriate for the visual sensory diet tools, they are my first choice to use. Because now I don't have to take a child through a semester-long or a year-long program to teach them self-modulation. I can set up a visual program and spend 10 or 15 minutes going over it with him and his teachers and parents, and he learns through its use. He begins learning what strategies work well for him and what don't, and what does it feel like when I'm going too fast, and what does it feel like when I'm going too slow. So this is my first choice when appropriate. As far as who is age and developmentally appropriate, I wish there were a cookbook answer. There's not. It depends on the cognitive level and more. But in general, I would say between the ages of 3 and 10, that's prime. Those kids love the interactive nature. They love the visuals. They love the choice-based component. So I love to catch them between the ages of 3 and 10. But there are definitely some ways we can adapt for younger kids with the use of visuals, and for teenagers and beyond, especially for teens and adults who will continue to use visual communication tools throughout their lifetime. This could continue to be appropriate for years to come. Now, if you want to use visual sensory diet tools, there are some options. BrainWorks is mine, therefore I'm a little bit biased, and you are all getting free access to membership to BrainWorks Online for your participation in this course. So we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about it than the others, but I want to start by talking about the others, and then we'll come back to BrainWorks. Stick Kids is software that's present in your computer, and it allows you to select and print sensory activity cards, and they have icons on them that help you know if it has a calming effect. That the icon would be a tortoise, or an alerting effect, in which case you would see the rabbit icon, or a just right effect, where you see the just right dude on that card. So it's good for teaching kids to choose strategies based on their needs. You can also make visual sensory diet tools with pictures for PECS or Boardmaker. There are picture cards that represent almost all sensory strategies that we use. The only downside to using pictures for PECS or Boardmaker or Do to Learn, which is an online program that's similar, is that there's nothing on the cards to indicate whether the activity has a calming or an alerting effect. And that's not very intuitive when we first get started. So if you use, like I used to use pictures for PECS to create what has evolved into the file folder tools that I'm going to show you. But I took the time to outline, and I used the alert program back then also. So if it were a calming strategy, I outlined it with red, meaning this is going to help you calm down or slow down like a car will at a red light. If it were alerting strategy, I outlined it in green, meaning this is going to help you get going like a car does at a green light. So you can color code them, or some early intervention therapists get a bunch of Winnie the Pooh themed stickers and put a Tigger sticker on the back of activities that are alerting, an Eeyore sticker on the back of the activities that are calming, and so forth. So, your imagination is the limit, but I would find a way to indicate whether the activities have a calming or alerting or just right effect on the nervous system. You can also use Google Images or actual photographs of the child with their sensory strategies or on their sensory equipment. In general, research does not indicate we need to use photos. There have been some studies looking at, can kids with autism and cognitive impairments make the leap to what could be considered abstract art. Like, for example, if our picture of a cozy corner looks very different than the cozy corner in your classroom, can these kids make the leap to know that this picture represents cozy corner? And the studies overwhelmingly say yes, but I always leave that decision up to the speech therapist. And if the speech therapist says they're at a very concrete level and we need actual photographs, then we use actual photographs. It takes me a little bit longer to put the tools in place, but I can do that. And then I still find a way to indicate whether the activity has a calming or alerting effect on it, either by outlining with colors or using stickers, something like that. So I just leave that up to the speech therapist and we can go from there. Okay. It is time for our lunch break. It is 12:15 Eastern time. I'm going to start talking about I'm going to start talking again at 1 o'clock Eastern time. I'm going to turn off my recording, and then I have a couple of instructions for the people who are here live. So stay on for just a minute with me.